most people already suspect but don't think about too deeply. The simple life seemed like harmless fun, two rich girls pretending to be country folk for laughs, but Paris Hilton's seemingly manufactured dumb blonde persona wasn't just an act for the cameras. Years later, we learned it was a coping mechanism developed during her traumatic experiences at abusive boarding schools where she faced physical and emotional torture. Her ditzy behavior was actually dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism she developed to survive institutional abuse. The show's producers knew about her trauma but exploited it anyway, turning her pain into punchlines. They deliberately played up her apparent stupidity because audiences found it amusing, never acknowledging that they were essentially mocking a trauma response. The real Paris Hilton was highly intelligent and business-savvy, but that version wouldn't have fit the narrative they wanted to sell. The Biggest Loser promoted itself as inspirational transformation television. Behind the scenes, contestants were subjected to dehydration tactics, forced to exercise on injuries, and given dangerous supplements. Trainers screamed at people until they collapsed, and medical staff were instructed to clear contestants for competition, even when injured. The psychological damage was immense. Many developed eating disorders worse than before the show. Follow-up studies revealed that most contestants not only regained their lost weight, but gained even more. Their metabolisms permanently damaged by the extreme methods. The show created a cycle of shame and failure while pretending to offer hope. Contestants described being given appetite suppressants, diuretics, and being encouraged to exercise in saunas to lose water weight before weigh-ins. Some were hospitalized during filming, but these incidents were edited out to maintain the show's inspiring facade. Fear Factor took the concept of human degradation and packaged it as courage. Contestants were forced to eat live insects, rotting food, and animal organs while being told this demonstrated bravery. The show normalized the idea that self-respect was something to be traded for money and fame. Many participants reported lasting trauma from the disgusting challenges, with some developing severe food aversions and eating disorders. The show's creators deliberately designed challenges to be as psychologically damaging as possible, understanding that genuine distress made for better television than staged reactions. Wife Swap appeared to be social commentary but actually exploited family dysfunction for entertainment. Families in crisis were paired with polar opposites, ensuring maximum conflict. Children were often caught in the crossfire as their parents' worst qualities were amplified for dramatic effect. Many families reported their relationships were permanently damaged by the experience, with divorces and family splits occurring after filming. The show's producers specifically sought out families with existing tensions, then created situations designed to explode those conflicts on camera. These shows normalized the idea that entertainment could be built on human suffering as long as there was a supposed positive outcome. They established templates that would be used by far more disturbing programs later. The message was clear: anyone's dignity, trauma, or family relationships could be commodified if the price was right and the entertainment value was high enough. Level 2, Uncomfortable Truths, the industry's open secrets. Moving deeper, we encounter truths that industry insiders know but rarely discuss publicly. The Bachelor franchise operates on a foundation of psychological manipulation that would make cult leaders proud. Contestants are isolated from outside contact. Alcohol is freely provided while meals are restricted, and sleep deprivation is used as a standard practice. Producers deliberately cast people with specific psychological profiles: those seeking father figures, those with abandonment issues, those desperate for validation. They create artificial scarcity around the Bachelor's attention, triggering competitive behaviors and emotional breakdowns. The casting process itself is deeply unethical. Producers specifically seek out people in vulnerable life situations: recent divorces, financial difficulties, family tragedies. They promise life-changing opportunities while screening for mental health issues they can exploit. Contestants sign contracts that give producers unprecedented control over their lives and image, often for years after filming. These contracts include non-disclosure agreements, so restrictive that participants cannot seek therapy or discuss their experiences with mental health professionals without risking legal action. Former producers have revealed the calculated nature of the manipulation. They study contestants' psychological profiles and deliberately create scenarios designed to trigger their specific vulnerabilities. Someone with abandonment issues will be isolated from the group. Someone desperate for approval will be given positive reinforcement, then have it suddenly withdrawn. The goal is to create genuine emotional breakdowns that translate into compelling television. Love Island represents the evolution of this manipulation into something more systematic. The villa is designed as a psychological pressure cooker where every element, from the sleeping arrangements to the timing of new arrivals, is calculated to create maximum emotional instability. Former contestants describe feeling like laboratory rats, their every reaction monitored and manipulated by unseen producers who communicate through speakers like the voice of an omnipresent god. The show deliberately casts people with specific psychological vulnerabilities, then creates scenarios designed to exploit them. Contestants with body image issues are placed in situations where they must constantly display their bodies. Those with relationship trauma are forced into artificial romantic situations designed to trigger their past pain. The villa's isolation, combined with constant surveillance and manipulation, creates a form of psychological imprisonment. The suicide rates among reality TV participants are statistically significant. Multiple Love Island contestants have taken their own lives, yet the show continues with minimal changes. The industry treats these deaths as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of compelling television, implementing superficial mental health measures that serve more as legal protection than genuine care. When confronted about these deaths, producers typically respond with scripted statements about mental health awareness while changing nothing about their fundamental practices. Survivor pushed the boundaries of what could be done to people under the guise of competition. Contestants were deliberately starved, deprived of sleep, and placed in psychologically manipulative situations. The show's creators understood that hunger and exhaustion made people more emotionally volatile and likely to create dramatic moments. Medical personnel were present but instructed to intervene only in life-threatening situations, allowing contestants to suffer through dangerous levels of dehydration, malnutrition, and psychological distress. The tribal council format was specifically designed to create public humiliation and betrayal. Contestants were forced to vote each other out while explaining their reasoning on camera, creating lasting psychological damage through forced confrontation and rejection. Many former contestants report trust issues and relationship problems that stem directly from their Survivor experience. Jersey Shore represented a different kind of exploitation, the commodification of toxic masculinity and dysfunctional relationships. Cast members were encouraged to drink excessively, engage in risky sexual behavior, and participate in physical altercations. The show glamorized alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and emotional manipulation while presenting it as entertaining lifestyle content. Cast members who tried to address their alcohol problems or leave toxic situations were often talked out of it by producers who needed their dysfunction for content. The show's success spawned numerous copycat programs that further normalized abuse and dysfunction as entertainment. The template became standard: find young people with existing problems, amplify those problems through artificial stressors, then film the resulting chaos while providing minimal support or intervention. Level 3, deeply disturbing, where ethics disappear entirely. Now we enter territory where the line between entertainment and abuse becomes completely blurred. Kid Nation stands as perhaps the most shocking example of child exploitation in television history. 40 children aged 8 to 15 were essentially abandoned in a desert ghost town with minimal adult supervision. The premise claimed to explore whether children could create a functioning society, but what actually happened was systematic psychological trauma inflicted on minors for entertainment. Children were forced to perform dangerous labor, including operating heavy machinery and handling fire. They experienced severe dehydration, injuries, and emotional breakdowns. One child drank bleach and was told to keep quiet about it to avoid shutting down production. The show's creators deliberately fostered conflict between children, rewarding aggressive behavior and punishing cooperation. Many participants reported lasting psychological damage from the experience, describing feelings of abandonment and betrayal that persisted into adulthood. The legal machinations that allowed this show to happen reveal the depths of industry corruption. Producers exploited loopholes in child labor laws by claiming the children were not actors but participants in a social experiment. They relocated production to New Mexico specifically to avoid California's stricter child protection regulations. Parents were required to sign away most of their rights to intervene, essentially selling their children's welfare for the promise of fame and money. The children were deliberately kept isolated from their parents and told that contact would result in elimination from the show. This isolation was designed to increase their emotional vulnerability and dependence on the production team. When children suffered injuries or emotional breakdowns, they were often denied adequate medical or psychological care to avoid disrupting the filming schedule. Intervention takes the exploitation of human suffering to another level by building entertainment around active addiction and family trauma. While marketed as helping people, the show often makes participants' situations worse by turning their most vulnerable moments into public spectacle. Families are coached to deliver ultimatums and engage in confrontational tactics that addiction specialists warn against. The show's intervention specialists have financial incentives to maintain dramatic tension rather than achieve genuine recovery. Many featured addicts have died shortly after appearing on the show, yet production continues to seek out increasingly desperate cases. The show creates a perverse economy where human tragedy becomes content, and the more severe the addiction, the more valuable the story becomes. Families are often coached to escalate their confrontational language and behavior to create more dramatic television moments, even when this approach contradicts established best practices for addiction intervention. The show's producers actively seek out people in the most desperate stages of addiction, often approaching families during crisis moments when they're least able to make informed decisions about participation. The promise of free treatment is used to secure participation, but the treatment programs featured on the show often have questionable success rates and are sometimes chosen more for their willingness to participate in filming than their therapeutic effectiveness. To Catch a Predator crossed the line from journalism into vigilante justice with disturbing implications. The show created fake profiles to lure potentially dangerous individuals, then publicly humiliated them on television before turning them over to law enforcement. While the stated goal was protecting children, the show's methods contaminated legal proceedings and potentially interfered with legitimate law enforcement operations. The show's confrontational approach often escalated dangerous situations, putting both crew members and the public at risk. Several individuals featured on the show committed suicide after their episodes aired, raising questions about the show's responsibility for these deaths. The program essentially created a form of public trial by television that circumvented due process and legal protections. The show's host positioned himself as a moral authority while participating in what was essentially entrapment for entertainment purposes. The blurring of lines between journalism, law enforcement, and entertainment created a dangerous precedent that influenced other programs to take similar vigilante approaches to sensitive issues. My Super Sweet 16 represented the exploitation of wealthy children for different but equally disturbing reasons. The show glamorized extreme materialism and entitled behavior while exposing wealthy teenagers to public ridicule and potential danger. Many featured families reported receiving death threats and experiencing severe backlash after their episodes aired. The show deliberately edited footage to make participants appear as spoiled and unlikable as possible, often taking comments out of context or manipulating situations to create more dramatic moments. Teenagers were encouraged to make increasingly outrageous demands and display increasingly entitled behavior, with producers coaching them on how to be more dramatic for the cameras. The long-term psychological impact on these young people was severe. Many reported struggling with public perception issues, difficulty forming genuine relationships, and problems adjusting to normal social situations after being portrayed as extremely privileged and out of touch. The show essentially traded these teenagers' future social and psychological well-being for entertainment value. Level 4, genuinely horrifying, the stuff of nightmares. At this level, we encounter reality television that crosses into territory indistinguishable from psychological torture. The Russian reality show Dom 2 has operated continuously since 2004, trapping participants in a compound where they're subjected to increasingly extreme scenarios designed to break down their psychological defenses. Participants have committed suicide on camera, engaged in non-consensual sexual acts while intoxicated, and suffered complete psychological breakdowns that were broadcast as entertainment. The show operates in a legal gray area where participants sign contracts that essentially make them property of the production company. They cannot leave without permission, have no access to outside communication, and are subjected to constant surveillance and manipulation. Former participants describe the experience as being held in a psychological prison where their trauma becomes content. The show's format involves keeping participants in a compound for months or even years, subjecting them to constant psychological pressure and manipulation. They are given alcohol and encouraged to engage in sexual activity on camera, with producers deliberately creating scenarios designed to lead to sexual assault or other traumatic experiences. The show has featured multiple suicides, overdoses, and severe psychological breakdowns, all of which were broadcast as entertainment. British reality television pushed boundaries even further with shows like There's Something About Miriam, which deceived male contestants into competing for the affections of a transgender woman without their knowledge. When the deception was revealed, several contestants experienced severe psychological trauma and attempted suicide. The show's creators knew the revelation would cause distress but filmed it anyway, turning human suffering into entertainment climax. The contestants were led to believe they were competing for a cisgender woman's affection, with the show's producers deliberately concealing information that would have allowed them to give informed consent to their participation. When the truth was revealed in a dramatic confrontation staged for maximum emotional impact, several contestants experienced severe psychological crisis. The show essentially used transphobia and sexual confusion as entertainment tools while potentially endangering both the transgender participant and the male contestants. The international format of these shows reveals how American television actually restrains itself compared to what happens in countries with weaker media regulations. In parts of Asia and Eastern Europe, reality shows regularly feature content that would be considered criminal in Western countries. Genuine torture, sexual assault, and psychological abuse presented as entertainment. Japanese reality television has featured shows where participants are subjected to extreme physical and psychological torture under the guise of endurance challenges. One notorious program kept a comedian locked in a room for over a year, naked and surviving only on contest winnings, while filming his mental deterioration for audience entertainment. The participant experienced severe psychological trauma and required extensive therapy after the show ended. Chinese reality television has featured shows involving deliberate psychological torture, including programs where participants are subjected to extreme humiliation, physical discomfort, and emotional manipulation.
These shows often target people from rural or economically disadvantaged backgrounds who are desperate for money and fame, exploiting their vulnerability for urban audiences' entertainment. Several international reality formats have featured scenarios indistinguishable from human trafficking, where participants are transported to foreign countries under false pretenses and subjected to conditions that meet definitions of modern slavery. These shows exploit people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, promising life-changing opportunities while delivering trauma and exploitation. The psychological testing and profiling used by reality TV casting has evolved into sophisticated systems for identifying and exploiting human vulnerabilities. Former casting directors describe databases containing detailed psychological profiles of potential participants, organized by trauma type and exploitation potential. These systems represent industrialized abuse, where human suffering becomes a renewable resource to be harvested systematically. Level 5: The Abyss. What exists but cannot be broadcast. At the deepest level of this iceberg lie reality shows so disturbing they exist primarily in underground markets or heavily censored versions that hint at darker content. These programs represent the logical endpoint of reality television's trajectory toward increasingly extreme exploitation. The content at this level is so disturbing that it challenges our understanding of what constitutes entertainment versus outright abuse. Certain international productions have featured scenarios that mental health professionals classify as systematic torture. These shows deliberately inflict severe psychological trauma on participants through prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation techniques borrowed from military interrogation methods. Participants are broken down psychologically and rebuilt according to the show's narrative requirements, with the entire process filmed and broadcast. Some productions deliberately cast individuals with severe mental health issues, knowing their breakdowns will create compelling television. Participants with bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, and severe depression are specifically sought out and placed in environments designed to trigger their conditions. Medical professionals involved in these productions describe being pressured to clear psychologically vulnerable participants for filming despite obvious risks. Underground reality programming in certain countries has featured content that meets international definitions of torture, including prolonged stress positions, temperature extremes, and psychological techniques designed to break down personality structure. These programs exist in legal gray areas where media regulations are weak or non-existent, allowing producers to subject participants to treatment that would be considered criminal in most jurisdictions. The insurance and legal frameworks surrounding these shows reveal the industry's awareness of the harm they cause. Production companies carry massive insurance policies specifically covering participant deaths and psychological damage. Legal teams specialize in contracts that absolve producers of responsibility for virtually any outcome while ensuring participants cannot speak publicly about their experiences. Some international formats have featured deliberate medical experimentation on participants, including testing of psychological manipulation techniques, pharmaceutical interventions, and behavioral modification protocols. These shows blur the line between entertainment and human experimentation, with participants serving as test subjects for psychological research conducted without proper ethical oversight. The most disturbing programs at this level involve the systematic destruction of participants' existing identities and relationships, followed by reconstruction according to predetermined narrative requirements. This process involves techniques borrowed from cult programming and military psychological operations, applied for entertainment purposes with devastating long-term consequences for participants. Understanding why audiences consume this content reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and modern society. Reality TV exploits our fundamental psychological needs for social comparison, schadenfreude, and vicarious experience. We watch people suffer because it makes us feel better about our own lives, and we watch people succeed because it gives us hope for transformation. But the psychological mechanisms that make reality TV compelling are the same ones that make us vulnerable to propaganda, manipulation, and social control. The shows create parasocial relationships where viewers develop genuine emotional connections to participants, making their suffering feel meaningful rather than exploitative. This emotional investment keeps audiences returning despite growing awareness of the show's harmful nature. Viewers become complicit in the exploitation by continuing to watch, creating a market demand that drives increasingly extreme content. Social media has amplified this dynamic by allowing viewers to extend their participation beyond watching. Audiences can now directly harass participants, creating additional layers of trauma that producers anticipate and sometimes encourage through strategic editing and narrative framing. The interaction between traditional broadcast content and social media harassment creates a feedback loop of abuse that can destroy participants' lives long after filming ends. The psychological profiling used to cast reality TV participants has become increasingly sophisticated, with producers employing techniques developed for military and intelligence applications. Potential participants are screened for specific psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited for dramatic effect, with casting directors specifically seeking people whose trauma and mental health issues will create compelling television. The business model of human suffering. Reality television represents a business model built on extracting value from human trauma and vulnerability. Production costs are minimal compared to scripted content, while emotional intensity drives higher engagement and advertising revenue. The more someone suffers, the more valuable they become as content. This economic reality creates perverse incentives throughout the industry where human welfare is subordinated to profit margins. This economic model has created an entire ecosystem of exploitation that extends far beyond individual shows. Talent agencies specialize in representing vulnerable people for reality TV. Casting companies maintain databases of traumatized individuals organized by exploitation potential. Production companies develop increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying and manipulating human psychological vulnerabilities. The international syndication of reality formats spreads these harmful practices globally, often to countries with weaker participant protections and media oversight. American-created show formats are exported worldwide, carrying their exploitative practices to cultures and legal systems unprepared to regulate them. This global expansion has created a race to the bottom where different countries compete to offer the most extreme content with the fewest legal restrictions. Network executives and advertisers maintain plausible deniability about the harm caused by these shows through layers of production companies and international partnerships. The people making money from human suffering are often several steps removed from the actual exploitation, allowing them to profit while avoiding direct responsibility for the consequences. The long-term consequences and societal impact. The psychological damage inflicted by reality television extends far beyond individual participants to affect families, communities, and society broadly. Children of reality TV participants often suffer ongoing trauma from having their family's dysfunction broadcast globally. Communities featured in these shows experience lasting stigma and economic disruption. The ripple effects of reality TV exploitation touch thousands of people who never signed contracts or consented to participate. The normalization of exploitation as entertainment has broader cultural implications, making audiences more accepting of abuse in other contexts. Reality TV has contributed to a culture where privacy invasion, public humiliation, and psychological manipulation are seen as acceptable forms of entertainment. This cultural shift has implications for how we treat vulnerable people in all areas of society. Former participants describe feeling like their trauma has been commodified and sold, leaving them feeling violated and powerless. Many struggle with ongoing mental health issues, financial problems from predatory contracts, and social stigma from their television appearances. The long-term psychological consequences often don't manifest until years after filming, making it difficult to establish direct causal relationships that could support legal action. The reality TV industry has created a generation of young people who view public humiliation and emotional manipulation as normal parts of life. Social media platforms have adopted many of the psychological manipulation techniques pioneered by reality TV, creating environments where ordinary people subject themselves to the same kinds of exploitation that were once limited to television participants. Moving forward, what this means for our future. The reality television industry's trajectory toward increasingly extreme exploitation reflects broader societal problems with how we value human dignity and consent. These shows exist because audiences demand them and advertisers fund them, making us all complicit in their continued existence. The question is whether we can recognize this complicity and make different choices about the media we consume and support. Understanding this iceberg of disturbing content should prompt serious questions about media literacy, ethical consumption, and the responsibility of platforms that distribute this content. The entertainment industry's willingness to profit from human suffering represents a moral crisis that extends far beyond television into questions about how we treat each other in an increasingly connected but dehumanized world. As consumers of media, we have the power to demand better through our viewing choices and social pressure. The most disturbing reality shows succeed because they tap into genuine human needs for connection, transformation, and meaning. Needs that could be met through more ethical forms of entertainment. But meeting those needs requires acknowledging what we're really seeking when we watch people suffer for our entertainment.
Teen Mom began as what seemed like a socially conscious spin-off of 16 and Pregnant, following young mothers as they navigated the challenges of parenthood. The network marketed it as educational programming that would discourage teen pregnancy by showing its harsh realities. What actually happened was the systematic documentation and broadcast of severe domestic violence, child abuse, and mental health crises presented as ongoing entertainment for millions of viewers. Amber Portwood's story represents the most disturbing example of how reality television can amplify and monetize abuse. Amber was cast on Teen Mom when she was just 17 years old, already struggling with severe mental health issues, drug addiction, and an abusive relationship with her partner Gary Shirley. Instead of providing support or intervention, MTV's cameras followed her descent into increasingly violent behavior, broadcasting her physical attacks on Gary while their infant daughter was present in the home. The network didn't just passively document this violence, they actively encouraged it through their editing choices and narrative framing. Scenes of Amber physically attacking Gary were edited for maximum dramatic impact, with music and camera angles that emphasized the spectacle rather than the serious nature of what was happening. The show's producers knew they were witnessing criminal domestic violence, but chose to keep filming rather than intervene or stop production. Multiple episodes featured Amber punching, slapping, and throwing objects at Gary while their young daughter Leah was in the room. These weren't brief altercations edited out of context, they were sustained attacks that constituted clear criminal assault. The cameras captured Amber hitting Gary with enough force to leave visible injuries, threatening him with weapons, and engaging in behavior that would result in arrest if witnessed by law enforcement rather than television producers. What makes this particularly disturbing is how the network framed these incidents. Rather than presenting them as serious domestic violence that required intervention, MTV edited the footage to create ongoing drama and viewer engagement. Amber's violence was portrayed as relationship conflict rather than criminal behavior, with promotional materials and episode descriptions treating her attacks as relationship drama rather than assault. The show's impact on the children involved represents an additional layer of exploitation that's difficult to fully comprehend. Leah was present during many of these violent incidents, with cameras rolling as she witnessed her mother's attacks on her father. The trauma of living in an abusive household was compounded by having that abuse broadcast to millions of viewers, creating a permanent record of her childhood trauma that would follow her throughout her life. MTV's legal and ethical obligations were clear. They were witnessing ongoing child endangerment and domestic violence. In most jurisdictions, mandated reporters are required to contact authorities when they witness child abuse or domestic violence. Instead, the network continued filming and broadcasting this content while claiming it served an educational purpose about the challenges of teen parenthood. The network's handling of Amber's drug use reveals another dimension of the ethical failures involved. MTV documented Amber's obvious substance abuse, including scenes where she appeared to be under the influence while caring for her young daughter. Rather than intervening or connecting her with treatment resources, the network continued filming her deterioration as content for the show. Amber's arrests and legal troubles were incorporated into the show's storylines as dramatic plot points rather than serious consequences of the behavior MTV had been documenting and broadcasting. When she was finally arrested for domestic violence, the network treated it as a storyline development rather than the inevitable consequence of behavior they had been enabling and profiting from for years. The impact on Gary Shirley, the victim of Amber's violence, demonstrates how reality TV can re-victimize abuse survivors. Gary was contractually obligated to continue participating in the show even after suffering physical abuse on camera. The network's contracts essentially trapped him in an abusive situation while broadcasting his victimization as entertainment. His attempts to protect himself and his daughter were edited and framed to maintain dramatic tension rather than supporting his safety. The show's portrayal of their relationship consistently minimized the seriousness of Amber's violence while focusing on relationship drama and conflict. Episodes would feature Amber's physical attacks followed immediately by scenes of them discussing their relationship as if the violence was just another relationship challenge rather than criminal behavior that endangered both Gary and their child. MTV's editorial choices reveal the calculated nature of this exploitation. The network had hours of footage showing the escalation of Amber's violent behavior over months and years. They could have chosen to intervene, stop filming, or present the content in ways that emphasized the serious nature of domestic violence. Instead, they edited the material to maximize dramatic impact and viewer engagement while minimizing the apparent severity of what they were broadcasting. The long-term consequences for everyone involved have been devastating. Amber has struggled with ongoing legal problems, including multiple arrests, prison sentences, and continuing issues with substance abuse and mental health. Her violent behavior was amplified and normalized through repeated broadcast, making it more difficult for her to recognize the seriousness of her actions or seek appropriate help. Gary has had to navigate the aftermath of having his abuse broadcast to millions of viewers while trying to protect his daughter from the ongoing impact of their family's trauma being treated as public entertainment. The permanent nature of television content means that Leah will always have access to footage of her mother's violent behavior and the traumatic circumstances of her early childhood. The network's treatment of subsequent incidents involving Amber reveals the systematic nature of this exploitation. When Amber was arrested for domestic violence against a different partner years later, MTV incorporated this into new programming while maintaining their stance that their coverage serves an educational purpose. The pattern shows that the network learned nothing from the harmful consequences of their previous coverage and continued to profit from documenting and broadcasting domestic violence. A Shot at Love with Tila Tequila, exploiting mental health crisis as entertainment. A Shot at Love with Tila Tequila represents a different but equally disturbing form of unethical exposure, the systematic exploitation of someone experiencing severe mental health issues while millions of viewers watched her psychological deterioration as entertainment. Tila Tequila, whose real name is Tila Nguyen, was already struggling with significant mental health challenges when MTV cast her as the star of a reality dating show that would ultimately accelerate and amplify her psychological crisis. The show's premise appeared relatively straightforward: a bisexual woman choosing between male and female suitors in a dating competition format. What actually unfolded was the documentation of someone experiencing severe psychological distress, substance abuse, and the early stages of what would become a very public mental health crisis that continues to impact her life today. MTV's casting of Tila reveals the deliberate nature of this exploitation. The network knew about her history of mental health struggles, substance abuse, and unstable relationships when they offered her the show. Rather than seeing these as red flags that should disqualify her from participation, producers viewed her psychological vulnerability as an asset that would create more dramatic television content. During filming, Tila exhibited clear signs of psychological distress that were edited and presented as entertainment rather than concerning behavior requiring intervention. She displayed erratic mood swings, made bizarre statements that suggested possible delusional thinking, and engaged in increasingly dangerous and self-destructive behavior that was captured by cameras and broadcast to millions of viewers. The show's editing deliberately emphasized Tila's most unstable moments while providing no context about mental health or the concerning nature of what viewers were witnessing. Scenes that showed clear signs of psychological crisis were edited with upbeat music and presented as quirky personality traits rather than symptoms of serious mental health issues requiring professional intervention. The network's handling of Tila's substance use during filming represents another dimension of the ethical failures involved. Multiple episodes featured Tila appearing to be under the influence of alcohol or other substances while making important decisions about relationships and her future. Rather than intervening or providing support, producers encouraged this behavior because it created more dramatic and unpredictable television content. The show's impact on Tila's existing mental health issues was immediately apparent to viewers and industry professionals, but MTV continued production while her psychological state deteriorated on camera. Former crew members later reported being concerned about Tila's welfare during filming but being instructed to continue working rather than intervening or suggesting she receive professional help. The dating competition format was particularly harmful to someone experiencing psychological instability. The artificial pressure of choosing between multiple romantic partners while being filmed constantly created additional stress that exacerbated Tila's existing mental health challenges. The show's structure required her to engage in intimate conversations and make emotional decisions while cameras documented her most vulnerable moments. MTV's promotional materials for the show deliberately marketed Tila's erratic behavior as entertainment value rather than acknowledging the concerning nature of what they were broadcasting. Trailers and advertisements featured her most unstable moments as selling points for the show, encouraging viewers to tune in to watch someone who was clearly struggling with serious psychological issues. The network's treatment of contestants who expressed concern about Tila's welfare reveals the systematic nature of this exploitation. Several participants in the dating competition later reported being worried about Tila's mental state during filming but being discouraged from addressing these concerns or offering support. The show's producers wanted dramatic conflict, not genuine care or intervention. The immediate aftermath of the show's broadcast demonstrated the harmful impact of this exploitation. Tila's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning, with her mental health crisis playing out publicly on social media and in tabloid coverage. Rather than providing support or taking responsibility for their role in amplifying her psychological distress, MTV distanced themselves from her while continuing to profit from reruns and international syndication of the show. Tila's subsequent public breakdown included incidents of self-harm, bizarre social media posts suggesting delusional thinking, and increasingly dangerous behavior that put both herself and others at risk. Mental health professionals who reviewed her post-show behavior noted clear signs of severe psychological crisis that appeared to have been exacerbated by the stress and exposure of reality television. The long-term impact on Tila's mental health has been devastating and ongoing. She has struggled with continued psychological instability, making public statements that suggest ongoing delusional thinking, and has had difficulty maintaining stable relationships or employment. The permanent nature of television content means that her psychological crisis was documented and continues to be available for public consumption years later. MTV's response to criticism about their handling of Tila's mental health crisis reveals the network's priorities and ethical framework. Rather than acknowledging any responsibility for the harmful impact of their programming, network executives defended the show as entertainment while maintaining that participants were responsible for their own welfare. This response ignores the power dynamic between vulnerable individuals and major media corporations with extensive resources and legal protections. The show's international syndication and continued availability through streaming platforms means that Tila's psychological crisis continues to be consumed as entertainment by new audiences worldwide. The network continues to profit from content that documented someone's mental health deterioration while providing no support or intervention during her crisis. The systematic nature of unethical exposure. These cases reveal that unethical exposure in reality television isn't accidental or incidental.
It's a systematic approach to content creation that deliberately seeks out vulnerable people and amplifies their worst moments for entertainment value. Networks have developed sophisticated methods for identifying people whose personal struggles will create compelling television while maintaining legal protections that shield them from responsibility for the consequences. The casting processes for these shows specifically target people experiencing crisis situations, mental health issues, or unstable relationships because these factors create the dramatic tension that drives viewer engagement. Casting directors are trained to identify psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited for content while ensuring that participants sign contracts that absolve networks of responsibility for harmful outcomes. The production methods used in these shows are designed to exacerbate existing problems rather than provide support or intervention. Participants are isolated from their support systems, provided with alcohol and other substances that impair judgment, and placed in artificially stressful situations designed to trigger emotional breakdowns or violent behavior. The editing and presentation of this content reveals the calculated nature of the exploitation involved. Networks have teams of editors and producers whose job is to identify the most psychologically damaging or violent moments and edit them for maximum dramatic impact. These professionals are trained to recognize signs of mental health crisis, substance abuse, and dangerous behavior, but their role is to amplify these problems for entertainment rather than intervening or seeking help for participants. The legal frameworks surrounding these shows are specifically designed to protect networks from liability while trapping participants in exploitative situations. Contracts include provisions that prevent participants from seeking therapy or discussing their experiences publicly, making it difficult for them to get help or hold networks accountable for harmful treatment. The broader impact on society and media ethics. The unethical exposure documented in shows like Teen Mom and A Shot at Love with Tila Tequila has broader implications for media ethics and social responsibility that extend far beyond individual programs. These shows normalize the idea that personal crisis, mental health issues, and domestic violence could be treated as entertainment content rather than serious problems requiring intervention and support. The success of these programs encouraged other networks to adopt similar approaches, leading to an entire genre of television built on exploiting vulnerable people during their worst moments. This has created a media landscape where human suffering is routinely commodified and consumed as entertainment, while networks profit from content that would be considered unethical in most other professional contexts. The impact on viewers, particularly young people, has been significant and concerning. These shows present domestic violence, mental health crisis, and self-destructive behavior as normal relationship dynamics rather than serious problems requiring intervention. This normalization contributes to a culture where abuse and psychological distress are minimized or treated as entertainment rather than urgent issues requiring support and resources. The international syndication of these programs spreads these harmful messages globally, often to audiences in countries with different cultural contexts and fewer resources for addressing domestic violence or mental health issues. The export of American reality television formats has contributed to the global normalization of exploiting vulnerable people for entertainment. Moving forward, the need for accountability and change. The cases of Amber Portwood and Tila Tequila represent clear examples of how reality television crossed the line from entertainment into systematic exploitation and harm. These shows documented serious crimes, mental health crises, and child endangerment while presenting them as ongoing entertainment for mass consumption. The networks involved have never been held accountable for their role in amplifying and profiting from domestic violence, child endangerment, and mental health crisis. The legal protections they've established through participant contracts and corporate structures have allowed them to avoid responsibility while continuing to profit from content that documented serious harm to vulnerable individuals. The ongoing availability of this content through reruns, streaming platforms, and international syndication means that the exploitation continues indefinitely. The permanent nature of television content ensures that the victims of this unethical exposure will never be able to escape the consequences of their participation while networks continue to profit from their suffering. Reform of the reality television industry requires recognition that current practices constitute systematic exploitation that causes real harm to participants and contributes to broader social problems. The industry's current self-regulation model has proven inadequate to prevent the most egregious forms of exploitation and abuse. The development of meaningful ethical standards for reality television must include protections for vulnerable participants, requirements for intervention when criminal behavior or mental health crises are documented, and accountability mechanisms that hold networks responsible for the long-term consequences of their programming decisions. The cases examined here represent just the most visible examples of unethical exposure in reality television. The systematic nature of these problems suggests that similar exploitation is occurring across the industry, often involving people who lack the public profile or resources to seek accountability or support. Understanding these cases as examples of systematic exploitation rather than isolated incidents is crucial for developing effective responses to the ongoing harm caused by reality television. The industry's current trajectory toward increasingly extreme content suggests that without significant intervention, the exploitation will continue to escalate while more vulnerable people are harmed for entertainment purposes. The responsibility extends beyond the networks to include advertisers, streaming platforms, and audiences who continue to support and consume content built on human suffering. Creating meaningful change requires acknowledgement from all participants in the reality television ecosystem that current practices cause real harm and cannot be justified by entertainment value or profit margins. These shows represent a turning point where reality television abandoned any pretense of serving participants' interests and openly embraced exploitation as a business model. The long-term consequences for the individuals involved continue to unfold while networks profit from their ongoing suffering, creating a system where human trauma becomes a renewable resource for entertainment content. The unethical exposure documented in these programs reveals the urgent need for accountability, regulation, and fundamental changes to how reality television operates. Without such changes, the industry will continue to identify vulnerable people, amplify their worst moments, and profit from their destruction while audiences consume their suffering as entertainment.
Bridalplasty premiered in 2010 as what the network described as the ultimate wedding makeover show. But what actually unfolded was a systematic attack on women's self-worth disguised as bridal preparation. The show's premise was deeply disturbing from conception. 12 women competed in challenges for the privilege of receiving extensive plastic surgery procedures before their weddings, with the implicit message that they were not acceptable as brides in their natural state. The show's format was deliberately designed to maximize psychological damage by targeting one of the most emotionally vulnerable moments in many women's lives, their wedding preparation. The producers understood that women planning weddings are already dealing with intense pressure about appearance, family expectations, and social judgment. Rather than providing support during this stressful time, bridalplasty amplified these insecurities and weaponized them for entertainment. The casting process specifically targeted women with existing body image issues and low self-esteem who could be easily manipulated into believing they needed extensive surgical modification to be worthy of marriage. Casting directors sought out women who expressed dissatisfaction with their appearance and convinced them that their wedding day would be ruined unless they underwent multiple surgical procedures. This predatory targeting of vulnerable women reveals the calculated nature of the psychological exploitation involved. The show's challenges were designed to reinforce negative self-image and create competitive dynamics that pitted women against each other based on appearance and surgical aspirations. Contestants were required to discuss their physical flaws in detail, explain why they believed they needed surgical modification, and compete for the right to have their bodies surgically altered. These challenges created an environment where women were rewarded for expressing self-hatred and punished for self-acceptance. The surgical procedures offered as prizes were extensive and dangerous, including multiple facial surgeries, breast augmentation, liposuction, and other major operations that carried significant medical risks. The show presented these invasive procedures as desirable rewards rather than serious medical interventions with potential complications and long-term consequences. This normalization of surgical risk for cosmetic purposes sent dangerous messages to viewers about the lengths women should go to achieve beauty standards. The show's treatment of the women's fiancés reveals another layer of the psychological manipulation involved. Fiancés were brought onto the show and encouraged to express dissatisfaction with their partner's appearance while supporting their desire for surgical modification. This created a dynamic where women received implicit messages that their partners found them inadequate and that surgical alteration was necessary for relationship success. The editing and presentation of the show deliberately emphasized the women's perceived flaws while minimizing their positive qualities. Camera angles, lighting, and editing techniques were used to make contestants appear less attractive, while their verbal expressions of self-doubt and body hatred were featured prominently. This editing approach reinforced negative self-image while presenting surgical modification as the obvious solution to their problems. The psychological impact on contestants was immediately apparent to viewers, but ignored by producers who prioritized dramatic content over participant welfare. Women who entered the show with existing body image issues experienced significant deterioration in their mental health as they were encouraged to focus obsessively on their perceived flaws and compete for the right to have them surgically corrected. The show's finale format was particularly cruel, featuring a bride who had undergone extensive surgical procedures walking down the aisle to a groom who had not seen her since before her surgeries. This created a scenario where the woman's worth as a bride was explicitly tied to her surgical modifications, with the wedding moment itself becoming a judgment of the surgical procedure's success rather than a celebration of love and commitment. The long-term psychological consequences for participants have been severe and ongoing. Many contestants have reported struggling with body dysmorphia, eating disorders, and relationship problems that stem directly from their participation in the show. The intensive focus on physical flaws and surgical modification as solutions created lasting damage to their self-image and relationship with their bodies. The show's impact on the surgical procedures themselves reveals another dimension of the harm involved. Several contestants experienced complications from their surgeries, including infections, scarring, and unsatisfactory results that required additional procedures. The rushed timeline of the show, combined with the pressure to undergo multiple procedures simultaneously, increased the medical risks and potential for complications. The network's handling of these medical complications was deeply problematic, with producers minimizing the seriousness of surgical risks while maximizing the dramatic impact of the procedures themselves. When complications occurred, they were either edited out of the broadcast or presented as minor setbacks, rather than serious medical issues that could have lasting consequences. The show's message about marriage and relationships was profoundly toxic, suggesting that women needed to undergo surgical modification to be worthy of their partner's love and commitment. This message reinforced harmful gender stereotypes while promoting the idea that physical appearance was more important than personal qualities in determining relationship success. The international syndication of bridalplasty spread these harmful messages globally, often to audiences in countries with different cultural contexts around beauty standards and surgical modification. The show's format was adapted for international markets, spreading the psychological manipulation techniques and harmful messages to vulnerable women worldwide. Are You Hot? The Systematic Humiliation Machine. Are You Hot debuted in 2003 as what appeared to be a simple beauty competition, but was actually a sophisticated psychological torture device designed to inflict maximum damage to participants' self-esteem and body image. The show's format was revolutionary in its cruelty. Contestants were evaluated solely on their physical appearance by a panel of judges who used laser pointers to highlight perceived flaws while cameras captured every moment of their humiliation. The show's premise was deceptively simple but psychologically devastating. Ordinary people would compete to be judged as attractive by celebrity judges who would evaluate their bodies with the clinical detachment of livestock judges. The laser pointers used to highlight contestants' flaws represented a technological innovation in humiliation that allowed judges to literally point out every perceived imperfection, while audiences watched the contestants' reactions to this public dissection of their bodies. The casting process specifically targeted people with existing insecurities about their appearance, who could be easily manipulated into participating in what was essentially public humiliation disguised as competition. Casting directors sought out individuals who were insecure enough to seek validation from television judges, but confident enough to appear on national television, creating a pool of participants who were maximally vulnerable to the psychological damage the show would inflict. The judging format was designed to maximize psychological impact by combining the authority of celebrity judges with the precision of laser pointer technology to create a clinical atmosphere where human bodies were evaluated like products. Judges would systematically examine each contestant's body, pointing out perceived flaws with laser pointers while providing commentary that was often cruel and personally devastating. The laser pointers themselves represented a particularly sadistic innovation in reality television cruelty. By using technology to literally point out perceived flaws, the show created a visual metaphor for judgment that was more psychologically damaging than verbal criticism alone. Contestants had to stand still while lights pointed out their supposed inadequacies, creating a form of technological torture that was unprecedented in television history. The show's judging panel consisted of celebrities and supposed beauty experts who were encouraged to provide harsh criticism and focus on contestants' flaws rather than positive qualities. This created an environment where cruelty was rewarded and kindness was discouraged, with judges competing to provide the most cutting commentary about contestants' appearances. The physical setup of the show was designed to maximize contestants' vulnerability and the judges' authority. Contestants were required to appear in minimal clothing, while judges remained fully clothed and positioned above them, creating a power dynamic that emphasized the contestants' vulnerability and objectification. The lighting and camera angles were specifically designed to emphasize perceived flaws, while the judges' elevated position reinforced their authority to pass judgment. The psychological impact on contestants was immediate and severe, with many experiencing visible distress during the judging process, as their bodies were systematically criticized and their flaws highlighted with laser technology. The show's format created a form of public humiliation that was more intense and personal than traditional beauty pageants or modeling competitions. The show's editing deliberately emphasized the most cruel moments of judging, while featuring contestants' emotional reactions to create maximum dramatic impact. The contrast between contestants' hopes for validation and the reality of systematic criticism created compelling television that was built entirely on human suffering and psychological damage. The long-term consequences for participants have been devastating, with many reporting lasting damage to their body image, self-esteem, and relationships.
The experience of having their bodies systematically criticized with laser pointer precision, while cameras documented their humiliation, created trauma that many contestants have struggled to overcome years later. The show's impact on viewers was equally concerning, normalizing the idea that it was acceptable and entertaining to systematically humiliate people based on their appearance. The show's popularity demonstrated audience appetite for content that was explicitly designed to inflict psychological damage on participants, while providing entertainment for viewers. The technical innovation of using laser pointers to highlight perceived flaws represented a new level of cruelty in reality television that influenced subsequent programs. The idea of using technology to enhance humiliation became a template that other shows would adapt and expand upon, creating an arms race of technological cruelty in reality television. The show's judges were encouraged to provide commentary that was not just critical, but personally devastating, with producers coaching them to focus on contestants' most sensitive areas and deliver criticism in ways that would create maximum emotional impact. This coaching reveals the calculated nature of the psychological abuse involved and the network's prioritization of dramatic content over participant welfare. The science of psychological destruction. These shows represent the application of sophisticated psychological principles to create maximum mental health damage for entertainment purposes. The producers and network executives involved understood basic principles of human psychology and deliberately applied them to inflict trauma on participants while creating compelling television content. The targeting of specific psychological vulnerabilities reveals the systematic nature of this exploitation. Both shows specifically sought out people with existing body image issues, low self-esteem, and need for external validation, who would be most susceptible to the psychological manipulation involved. This predatory targeting demonstrates that the harm inflicted was not accidental, but deliberately engineered. The use of competition formats to amplify psychological damage shows sophisticated understanding of human social psychology. By creating artificial scarcity around validation and acceptance, these shows triggered competitive behaviors that made participants more willing to accept abuse and humiliation in pursuit of winning. The competitive element made the psychological manipulation more effective by creating investment in the outcome. The involvement of authority figures as judges created additional psychological pressure by invoking natural human tendencies to seek approval from perceived experts or celebrities. Participants were more likely to internalize criticism and accept abuse when it came from figures they perceived as having authority or expertise in appearance and attractiveness. The public nature of the humiliation amplified the psychological impact by adding shame and social consequences to the abuse. Participants knew that their humiliation was being broadcast to millions of viewers, creating additional layers of trauma that extended beyond the immediate experience of abuse to include ongoing social consequences. The permanent nature of television content means that the psychological abuse documented in these shows continues indefinitely. Participants can never escape the humiliation because it remains available for viewing through reruns, streaming services, and online platforms, creating ongoing trauma that extends far beyond the original broadcast period. The broader impact on society and culture. The psychological damage inflicted by these shows extends far beyond individual participants to influence broader cultural attitudes about appearance, self-worth, and the acceptability of public humiliation. These programs normalized the idea that it was entertaining and acceptable to systematically attack people's self-esteem and body image while audiences consumed their suffering as entertainment. The show's influence on beauty standards and body image has been significant and harmful, promoting the idea that extensive surgical modification was necessary for attractiveness, while normalizing the systematic criticism of human bodies. This influence has contributed to rising rates of body dysmorphia, eating disorders, and cosmetic surgery procedures, particularly among young women who were influenced by these programs. The normalization of public humiliation as entertainment has broader implications for social behavior and empathy. These shows taught audiences that it was acceptable and amusing to systematically attack people's appearance and self-worth, contributing to cultures of bullying and cruelty that extend far beyond television into social media and everyday interactions. The international syndication of these programs spread their harmful messages and psychological manipulation techniques globally, often to audiences in countries with different cultural contexts around beauty standards and public humiliation. This global influence has contributed to the worldwide spread of toxic beauty standards and acceptance of psychological abuse as entertainment. The long-term consequences and ongoing harm. The participants in these shows continue to suffer from the psychological damage inflicted years after the programs aired. Many report ongoing struggles with body dysmorphia, eating disorders, depression, and relationship problems that stem directly from their television experiences. The lasting nature of this damage demonstrates the serious harm caused by these programs and the inadequacy of any supposed entertainment value to justify the psychological destruction involved. The show's influence on subsequent reality television programming has been significant, with many later programs adopting similar psychological manipulation techniques and approaches to inflicting mental health damage for entertainment. The success of these shows demonstrated to networks that audiences would consume content explicitly designed to cause psychological harm, encouraging the development of even more extreme and damaging programs. The lack of accountability for the psychological damage caused by these shows reveals the inadequacy of current regulatory frameworks and industry self-regulation. The networks involved have never been held responsible for the lasting mental health consequences experienced by participants, while continuing to profit from content that documented systematic psychological abuse. The ongoing availability of these programs through streaming platforms and international syndication means that new audiences continue to be exposed to their harmful messages, while the original participants continue to experience ongoing trauma from their participation. The permanent nature of television content ensures that the psychological abuse documented in these shows continues indefinitely. Moving forward, the need for recognition and reform. The cases of Bridalplasty and Are You Hot represent clear examples of how reality television evolved into a sophisticated system for inflicting psychological damage while claiming to provide entertainment. These shows deliberately targeted vulnerable people, applied psychological manipulation techniques to maximize mental health damage, and broadcast the resulting trauma as entertainment for mass consumption. The systematic nature of the psychological abuse involved in these programs requires recognition that they represent more than just poor taste or exploitative television. They constitute deliberate attempts to inflict mental health damage for profit while contributing to broader cultural problems around body image, self-worth, and the acceptability of public humiliation. The ongoing impact of these shows on both participants and society demonstrates the need for accountability measures that address the long-term consequences of psychological abuse in reality television. Current industry practices provide no meaningful protection for vulnerable participants, while allowing networks to profit from content that causes lasting mental health damage. The development of ethical standards for reality television must include recognition that psychological manipulation and deliberate attacks on self-esteem constitute abuse that cannot be justified by entertainment value or commercial success. The industry's current trajectory toward increasingly extreme psychological manipulation suggests that without significant intervention, the harm will continue to escalate. The responsibility for addressing these problems extends beyond the television industry to include mental health professionals, regulatory bodies, and audiences who consume and support content built on psychological abuse. Creating meaningful change requires acknowledgement from all stakeholders that current practices cause real and lasting harm that cannot be justified by entertainment purposes. These shows represent a turning point where reality television abandoned any pretense of serving participants' interests and openly embraced psychological abuse as a business model. The sophisticated techniques used to inflict mental health damage demonstrate that the harm caused was not accidental but deliberately engineered by professionals who understood the psychological principles involved. The legacy of these programs continues to influence reality television production and cultural attitudes about appearance, self-worth, and acceptable treatment of vulnerable people. Understanding their impact is crucial for developing effective responses to the ongoing psychological damage caused by reality television and preventing similar harm in future programming. The psychological destruction documented in these shows reveals the urgent need for fundamental changes to how reality television operates, including meaningful protections for vulnerable participants, accountability for psychological harm, and recognition that some forms of entertainment cross ethical lines that cannot be justified by commercial success or audience demand.
Botched premiered as what the network marketed as a medical reality show focused on correcting cosmetic surgery disasters, but what actually unfolded was the systematic exploitation of people suffering from severe medical trauma and body dysmorphia. The show takes individuals who have experienced devastating surgical complications and turns their medical emergencies into entertainment content while claiming to provide help and hope. The show's format is deeply exploitative from its core concept. It identifies people who have suffered catastrophic cosmetic surgery failures and brings them on television to have their medical trauma examined, discussed, and broadcast to millions of viewers. These are people who are often dealing with severe physical disfigurement, chronic pain, infections, and psychological trauma from botched procedures, yet the show treats their suffering as compelling television content. The casting process specifically targets individuals who have experienced the most extreme and visually shocking surgical disasters. Casting directors seek out people whose cases are so severe that they will create maximum viewer engagement through shock value. This predatory approach to casting reveals that the network prioritizes entertainment value over genuine medical assistance or patient welfare. The cases featured on Botched often involve horrific medical negligence that has left people permanently disfigured or disabled. One particularly disturbing case involved a woman who had cement injected into her face by an unlicensed practitioner, causing severe disfigurement and ongoing health problems. Rather than treating this as the serious medical emergency and criminal case it represented, the show presented it as compelling television content, while the victim's trauma became entertainment for viewers. The show's presentation of these medical disasters often sensationalizes the horror while minimizing the genuine suffering involved. Camera work, editing, and narrative framing emphasize the shocking visual aspects of surgical disasters while treating the victim's pain and trauma as secondary to the entertainment value of their conditions. This approach dehumanizes people who are already suffering from severe medical and psychological trauma. The involvement of celebrity plastic surgeons creates a problematic dynamic where medical professionals participate in the entertainment exploitation of medical trauma while claiming to provide legitimate medical care. These doctors benefit professionally from their television exposure while participating in a system that treats severe medical emergencies as content for public consumption. The show's editing often includes graphic footage of surgical procedures and medical examinations that would be considered private medical information in any other context. Patients are required to sign extensive waivers allowing their medical procedures to be filmed and broadcast, often while they are dealing with severe psychological distress that may impair their ability to fully understand the long-term consequences of this exposure. The selection of cases for the show reveals a deliberate preference for the most shocking and visually disturbing medical disasters, rather than cases that might be most treatable or where patients might benefit most from intervention. This selection bias demonstrates that entertainment value takes priority over medical necessity or patient outcomes in the show's decision-making process. The psychological impact on participants is often severe and inadequately addressed by the show's production. People who have experienced catastrophic surgical failures are dealing with trauma that extends far beyond the physical damage, including loss of identity, social isolation, depression, and anxiety about their appearance and future. The show's focus on the medical aspects often ignores or minimizes these psychological consequences. The show's treatment of patients who cannot be helped reveals another dimension of the exploitation involved. When the celebrity surgeons determine that a patient's condition is too severe to be corrected, this rejection is filmed and broadcast as part of the show's content. Patients who are already dealing with devastating medical trauma are subjected to additional public rejection and disappointment while cameras document their emotional response. The international syndication of Botched has spread this exploitation globally, often to countries with different medical and ethical standards, where the show's approach to medical privacy and patient exploitation may be even more problematic. The show's format has been adapted for international markets, spreading the normalization of medical trauma as entertainment content worldwide. The show's impact on medical tourism and cosmetic surgery practices has been significant and concerning. By featuring extreme cases of surgical disasters, while also showcasing successful corrective procedures, the show simultaneously warns about surgical risks, while promoting cosmetic surgery as a solution to appearance concerns. This contradictory messaging can influence vulnerable viewers to seek surgical procedures while inadequately preparing them for potential risks. There's Something About Miriam, orchestrated humiliation as entertainment. There's Something About Miriam represents one of the most deliberately cruel and exploitative reality TV experiments ever conceived, designed specifically to humiliate and psychologically damage both the transgender host and the male contestants through systematic deception and orchestrated revelation. The show was created with the explicit intention of causing maximum psychological trauma to all participants while audiences consume their suffering as entertainment. The show's premise was built on deception and transphobia from conception. 6 heterosexual men competed for the affections of Miriam Rivera, a transgender woman, without being told about her transgender identity. The entire format was designed to create a scenario where the revelation of Miriam's transgender status would cause maximum shock, disgust, and psychological trauma to the male contestants, while simultaneously exposing Miriam to potential violence and humiliation. The show's creators understood that revealing Miriam's transgender identity would likely cause severe psychological distress to the heterosexual male contestants who had developed romantic and sexual feelings for her. Rather than recognizing this as a reason not to create the show, producers designed the entire format around maximizing this psychological trauma and broadcasting it as entertainment content. The casting process for the male contestants specifically targeted individuals who would be most likely to react with shock, disgust, or anger when Miriam's transgender identity was revealed. Casting directors sought out men with traditional masculine attitudes and conservative views about gender and sexuality, who would provide the most dramatic reactions to the revelation. This predatory casting approach demonstrates that the show was designed from the beginning to inflict maximum psychological harm. The show's treatment of Miriam herself was equally exploitative and dangerous. Producers knowingly placed her in a situation where she would be exposed to potential violence, rejection, and humiliation from men who might feel deceived and angry about her transgender identity. The show's format essentially set up Miriam as a target for transphobic violence while claiming to celebrate her attractiveness and femininity. The revelation episode was designed and filmed to maximize the psychological impact on all participants. The male contestants were gathered together and told about Miriam's transgender identity in a confrontational setting designed to elicit the most dramatic emotional responses. Cameras captured their shock, anger, and distress while they processed information that challenged their understanding of their own sexuality and attraction. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was deeply traumatic for all participants. Several male contestants experienced severe psychological crisis, including panic attacks, emotional breakdowns, and what appeared to be would-be identity crises about their sexuality and attraction to Miriam. These reactions were filmed and broadcast as entertainment content while the participants received minimal psychological support or intervention. The show's editing and presentation deliberately emphasized the most shocking and emotionally damaging moments while providing no context about transgender identity, gender expression, or the psychological impact of the deception involved. The show treated transgender identity as a shocking revelation rather than a normal variation of human experience, reinforcing harmful stereotypes and transphobic attitudes. The legal consequences of the show's approach became apparent when several contestants filed lawsuits claiming psychological damage from their participation. The lawsuits alleged that the show's deceptive format had caused lasting psychological harm, and that the network had deliberately concealed information that would have allowed informed consent to participation. These legal challenges revealed the extent of the psychological damage inflicted by the show's format. The show's impact on Miriam was particularly tragic, as she was subjected to rejection, humiliation, and transphobic abuse while being told that this was an opportunity to showcase transgender beauty and acceptance. The contradiction between the show's stated goals and its actual impact on Miriam demonstrates the cynical nature of the exploitation involved. The international broadcast of the show spread its harmful messages about transgender identity globally, often to audiences in countries with limited understanding of transgender issues and fewer protections for transgender individuals. The show's portrayal of transgender identity as deceptive and shocking reinforced harmful stereotypes that contribute to discrimination and violence against transgender people worldwide. The moment of truth, weaponizing family secrets. The moment of truth represents perhaps the most sadistic psychological experiment ever broadcast as entertainment television, designed specifically to destroy families and relationships by forcing participants to reveal their most damaging secrets under lie detector pressure while cameras documented the resulting devastation. The show's format was explicitly designed to cause maximum psychological and social damage to participants and their families, while audiences consumed their destruction as entertainment. The show's premise was deceptively simple but psychologically devastating. Contestants were connected to lie detectors and asked increasingly personal and damaging questions about their relationships, behavior, and secrets. They were incentivized with money to answer truthfully, creating a scenario where financial pressure encouraged them to reveal information that would destroy their relationships and damage their families. The question selection process reveals the deliberately sadistic nature of the show's design. Producers researched participants' backgrounds extensively to identify the most damaging possible questions that would cause maximum harm to their relationships and social standing. Questions were specifically designed to reveal infidelity, criminal behavior, shameful secrets, and other information that would cause lasting damage to participants' lives. The lie detector format created additional psychological pressure by making participants believe that deception would be detected and exposed, even though polygraph tests are not scientifically reliable and are not admissible in most legal proceedings. This false sense of scientific accuracy encouraged participants to reveal damaging information they might otherwise have kept private. The show's most disturbing case involved a woman who revealed under lie detector pressure that her father had molested children. This revelation was broadcast as entertainment content while the woman's family was destroyed by the implications of her statement. The show treated this revelation of child abuse as compelling television content rather than a serious criminal matter requiring immediate intervention and investigation. The presence of family members during the questioning created additional psychological torture by forcing participants to reveal damaging information directly to the people who would be most hurt by these revelations. Spouses, children, and parents were required to sit and listen while their loved ones revealed infidelity, criminal behavior, and other secrets that would permanently damage their relationships. The show's format created scenarios where participants were forced to choose between financial gain and protecting their relationships, with the lie detector pressure making it difficult to avoid revealing damaging information. This created a form of psychological coercion where participants were pressured into destroying their own lives for entertainment purposes. The editing and presentation of the show deliberately emphasized the most shocking revelations and the most dramatic emotional responses from family members. The show's producers understood that the destruction of families and relationships was the primary source of entertainment value, and they edited the content to maximize the impact of these revelations. The long-term consequences for participants and their families have been devastating and permanent. Marriages ended, relationships were destroyed, and families were torn apart by revelations that were broadcast as entertainment. The show created lasting damage that extended far beyond the participants to affect their children, extended families, and communities. The show's approach to child abuse revelations was particularly problematic, as serious criminal allegations were treated as entertainment content rather than matters requiring immediate investigation and intervention. When participants revealed information about abuse or other criminal behavior, the show's producers prioritized dramatic content over the safety and welfare of potential victims. The science of sadistic experimentation. These shows represent the application of sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques, specifically designed to inflict maximum trauma on participants while creating compelling television content. The producers involved understood principles of human psychology and deliberately applied them to break down participants' defenses and extract their most damaging secrets or traumatic experiences. The use of authority figures, medical settings, and scientific equipment creates psychological pressure that makes participants more likely to comply with harmful requests or reveal damaging information. The perceived legitimacy of medical professionals, lie detector equipment, and television production creates a sense of authority that participants find difficult to resist. The targeting of specific psychological vulnerabilities reveals the systematic nature of the experimentation involved. All three shows specifically sought out people with existing trauma, medical emergencies, or relationship problems who would be most susceptible to the psychological manipulation techniques employed. This predatory targeting demonstrates that the harm inflicted was deliberately engineered rather than accidental. The creation of artificial pressure situations through time limits, financial incentives, and competitive formats amplifies the psychological impact of the experimentation. Participants are placed under extreme stress that impairs their judgment and makes them more likely to agree to harmful procedures or reveal damaging information they would normally keep private. The involvement of medical professionals, legal procedures, and scientific equipment creates a false sense of legitimacy that masks the exploitative nature of the experimentation. Participants are more likely to trust the process and ignore warning signs when the exploitation is disguised as medical treatment, legal procedure, or scientific testing. The broader impact on society and medical ethics. The sadistic experimentation documented in these shows has broader implications for medical ethics, informed consent, and the treatment of vulnerable people in media contexts. These programs normalize the idea that medical trauma, psychological manipulation, and family destruction could be treated as entertainment content while audiences consumed human suffering as television programming. The show's influence on medical tourism, cosmetic surgery practices, and attitudes toward transgender individuals has been significant and harmful. By treating medical disasters as entertainment content while simultaneously promoting surgical solutions, these shows have contributed to unrealistic expectations about medical procedures while inadequately preparing viewers for potential risks and complications. The normalization of deception, psychological manipulation, and family destruction as entertainment has broader implications for social trust and relationship stability. These shows taught audiences that it was acceptable and amusing to systematically destroy people's lives and relationships while consuming their suffering as entertainment content. The international syndication of these programs has spread their harmful approaches to medical ethics, transgender rights, and family relationships globally, often to audiences in countries with different cultural contexts and fewer protections for vulnerable individuals. This global influence has contributed to the worldwide spread of exploitative approaches to reality television programming. The long-term consequences and ongoing harm. The participants in these shows continue to suffer from the psychological and social damage inflicted years after the programs aired. Many report ongoing struggles with medical complications, social isolation, family estrangement, and psychological trauma that stem directly from their television experiences. The permanent nature of television content means that their trauma and humiliation remain available for public consumption indefinitely. The show's influence on subsequent reality television programming has been significant, with many later programs adopting similar approaches to psychological manipulation, medical exploitation, and family destruction for entertainment purposes. The success of these shows demonstrated to networks that audiences would consume content explicitly designed to cause maximum harm to participants. The lack of accountability for the psychological and social damage caused by these shows reveals the inadequacy of current regulatory frameworks and industry self-regulation. The networks involved have never been held responsible for the lasting consequences experienced by participants, while continuing to profit from content that documented systematic psychological torture. The ongoing availability of these programs through streaming platforms and international syndication means that new audiences continue to be exposed to their harmful approaches, while the original participants continue to experience ongoing trauma from their participation. The permanent nature of television content ensures that the sadistic experimentation documented in these shows continues to cause harm indefinitely. Moving forward, recognition and reform. The cases of Botched, There's Something About Miriam, and The Moment of Truth represent clear examples of how reality television evolved into a system for conducting sadistic psychological experiments on vulnerable people while claiming to provide entertainment. These shows deliberately design scenarios to inflict maximum psychological trauma while broadcasting the resulting suffering as television content. The systematic nature of the psychological manipulation and exploitation involved in these programs requires recognition that they represent more than just exploitative television. They constitute deliberate attempts to conduct psychological experiments on human subjects without proper ethical oversight or informed consent procedures. The ongoing impact of these shows on both participants and society demonstrates the need for accountability measures that address the long-term consequences of psychological experimentation in reality television. Current industry practices provide no meaningful protection for vulnerable participants while allowing networks to profit from content that causes lasting psychological and social damage. The development of ethical standards for reality television must include recognition that psychological manipulation, medical exploitation, and deliberate family destruction constitute forms of abuse that cannot be justified by entertainment value or commercial success.
The industry's current trajectory toward increasingly extreme psychological experimentation suggests that without significant intervention, the harm will continue to escalate. The responsibility for addressing these problems extends beyond the television industry to include medical professionals, mental health experts, legal authorities, and audiences who consume and support content built on sadistic experimentation. Creating meaningful change requires acknowledgement from all stakeholders that current practices constitute forms of psychological torture that cannot be justified by entertainment purposes. These shows represent a turning point where reality television abandoned any pretense of serving participants' interests and openly embraced sadistic experimentation as a business model. The sophisticated techniques used to inflict psychological trauma demonstrate that the harm caused was not accidental but deliberately engineered by professionals who understood the psychological principles involved. The legacy of these programs continues to influence reality television production and cultural attitudes about medical ethics, psychological manipulation, and the acceptable treatment of vulnerable people. Understanding their impact is crucial for developing effective responses to the ongoing psychological damage caused by reality television and preventing similar harm in future programming. The sadistic experimentation documented in these shows reveals the urgent need for fundamental changes to how reality television operates, including meaningful protections for vulnerable participants, ethical oversight of psychological manipulation techniques, and recognition that some forms of entertainment cross ethical and legal lines that cannot be justified by commercial success or audience demand.
Shattered premiered on Channel 4 in the UK in 2004 as what the network marketed as an endurance-based game show, but what actually unfolded was the systematic torture of human beings through prolonged sleep deprivation while cameras documented their psychological and physical deterioration for entertainment. The show's format was explicitly designed to inflict severe physiological and psychological damage on participants through a torture technique that has been banned by international human rights conventions when used in interrogation or detention contexts. The show's premise was deceptively simple but profoundly dangerous. Contestants were required to stay awake for over 7 consecutive days while competing in various challenges for a cash prize. What the network failed to adequately communicate to participants or audiences was that prolonged sleep deprivation constitutes a form of torture that causes severe psychological and physical damage, including hallucinations, psychosis, immune system collapse, and potentially fatal health complications. The casting process specifically targeted individuals who were desperate enough for money to subject themselves to what medical professionals recognize as systematic torture. Casting directors sought out people in financial distress who could be convinced to risk their physical and mental health for the possibility of winning prize money. This predatory targeting of financially vulnerable people reveals the calculated nature of the exploitation involved. The show's medical oversight was grossly inadequate for the level of physiological stress being imposed on participants. While medical personnel were present during filming, they were not equipped to properly monitor or treat the severe health complications that arise from prolonged sleep deprivation. The show's format essentially guaranteed that participants would experience serious medical emergencies while providing insufficient medical support to address these predictable complications. The psychological effects of prolonged sleep deprivation began manifesting within the first few days of filming, with contestants experiencing confusion, memory loss, emotional instability, and impaired judgment. Rather than recognizing these as serious medical symptoms requiring intervention, the show's producers treated them as compelling television content and encouraged contestants to continue despite obvious signs of psychological deterioration. One of the most disturbing documented cases involved a contestant who began experiencing severe hallucinations and delusions, including the belief that he was the Prime Minister of Australia. This level of psychological break from reality indicates severe psychosis brought on by sleep deprivation torture. Rather than immediately providing medical intervention and removing the contestant from the harmful situation, producers continued filming while his mental state deteriorated further. The show's editing and presentation deliberately emphasized the most shocking moments of psychological breakdown while minimizing the serious medical nature of what viewers were witnessing. Contestants' hallucinations, confusion, and obvious distress were edited with dramatic music and presented as entertaining spectacle rather than the serious medical emergencies they represented. The physical effects of prolonged sleep deprivation were equally severe and inadequately addressed by the show's production. Contestants experienced immune system suppression, cardiovascular stress, metabolic disruption, and other serious health complications that can have lasting consequences. The show's format guaranteed that participants would suffer these effects while providing minimal medical monitoring or intervention. The show's challenges and tasks were designed to exploit contestants' impaired cognitive function caused by sleep deprivation. Participants were required to make important decisions and perform complex tasks while suffering from severe cognitive impairment, creating scenarios that were both dangerous and exploitative. The show essentially weaponized sleep deprivation to create compelling television while endangering contestants' safety. The international recognition of sleep deprivation as a form of torture makes the show's format particularly disturbing. The United Nations and various human rights organizations have classified prolonged sleep deprivation as torture when used in detention or interrogation contexts. The show essentially applied these same techniques to entertainment purposes while claiming it was a harmless game show format. The long-term health consequences for participants have been severe and lasting. Many contestants reported ongoing sleep disorders, anxiety, depression, and other psychological problems that stem directly from their participation in the show. The physiological stress of prolonged sleep deprivation can cause permanent damage to the immune system, cardiovascular function, and neurological health. The show's legal framework exploited loopholes in broadcasting regulations and participant protection laws that were not designed to address systematic torture disguised as entertainment. Contestants signed waivers that essentially allowed the network to inflict torture while protecting the production company from legal liability for the predictable health consequences. The network's response to criticism about the show's harmful effects revealed their priorities and ethical framework. Rather than acknowledging the serious medical and ethical problems with the format, network executives defended the show as entertainment while claiming that participation was voluntary. This response ignores the power dynamics and financial pressures that make truly voluntary consent impossible in such contexts. The push. Psychological manipulation as social experiment. The push represents one of the most disturbing examples of psychological manipulation ever broadcast as entertainment, where mentalist Darren Brown systematically manipulated an unwitting participant into attempting murder while claiming it was a social experiment about obedience and compliance. The show crossed every conceivable ethical boundary by using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to push someone toward committing violence while audiences watched the process unfold. The show's premise was presented as an exploration of how ordinary people can be manipulated into committing extraordinary acts through social pressure and psychological manipulation. What actually occurred was the systematic psychological abuse of an unwitting participant who was subjected to hours of sophisticated manipulation designed to break down his moral boundaries and push him toward committing what he believed would be murder. The participant selection process reveals the predatory nature of the psychological manipulation involved. Darren Brown and his team specifically sought out an individual whose psychological testing suggested would be susceptible to the manipulation techniques they planned to employ. This targeting of psychological vulnerability demonstrates that the show was designed from the beginning to inflict psychological harm while testing the limits of human manipulation. The manipulation techniques employed throughout the show were sophisticated psychological warfare methods that have been developed and refined by intelligence agencies, cult leaders, and other groups seeking to control human behavior. These techniques included isolation, authority pressure, graduated commitment, social conformity pressure, and other methods designed to break down psychological resistance and moral boundaries. The show's format created an artificial environment where the participant was surrounded by actors and manipulated scenarios designed to gradually normalize increasingly extreme behavior. The participant was slowly conditioned to accept more and more unreasonable requests through a process of graduated escalation that mirrors techniques used in military training, cult indoctrination, and psychological torture. The climactic scenario involved manipulating the participant into believing he was pushing someone off a rooftop to their death. The psychological manipulation was so effective that the participant genuinely believed he was committing murder when he pushed what he thought was another person off the building. The show essentially created a scenario where someone believed they were becoming a murderer for entertainment purposes. The psychological impact on the participant during and after the manipulation was severe and inadequately addressed by the show's production. The participant experienced obvious distress and psychological trauma as he was pushed toward what he believed was committing murder. The show provided minimal psychological support while subjecting him to manipulation techniques that are known to cause lasting psychological damage. The ethical implications of the show extend far beyond the immediate participant to include questions about informed consent, psychological manipulation, and the boundaries of acceptable entertainment. The participant could not provide meaningful informed consent to the manipulation because revealing the show's true purpose would have undermined the experiment. This creates an impossible ethical situation where genuine consent is incompatible with the show's format. The show's presentation and editing emphasized the dramatic aspects of the psychological manipulation while minimizing the serious ethical and psychological issues involved. The program was marketed as a fascinating exploration of human psychology rather than documentation of systematic psychological abuse designed to push someone toward believing they were committing murder. The involvement of Darren Brown, a professional mentalist and psychological manipulator, adds another layer of ethical concern to the show's format. Brown used his professional skills and reputation to legitimize what was essentially psychological torture while claiming it served educational purposes about human susceptibility to manipulation and authority pressure. The show's international broadcast and streaming availability has spread its harmful approach to psychological manipulation globally, often to audiences who may not understand the serious ethical issues involved or the sophisticated nature of the manipulation techniques being demonstrated. The show essentially provides a blueprint for psychological manipulation while presenting it as entertainment content. The long-term psychological consequences for the participant remain largely unknown because the show provided inadequate follow-up care and monitoring. The psychological trauma of believing you have committed murder, even briefly, can have lasting consequences that may not manifest until years later. The show's format created psychological damage without adequate provisions for addressing the long-term consequences. Born in the Wild, endangering mothers and infants for entertainment. Born in the Wild represents perhaps the most reckless endangerment of human life ever broadcast as entertainment television, deliberately placing pregnant women and unborn children in life-threatening situations by encouraging childbirth in remote wilderness locations without adequate medical support or emergency backup. The show's format was explicitly designed to create maximum dramatic tension by introducing unnecessary medical risks that could result in the death of mothers, infants, or both. The show's premise involved convincing expectant mothers to give birth in remote wilderness locations far from medical facilities, often without qualified medical personnel or emergency equipment present. This format deliberately introduced life-threatening risks to both mothers and infants for the sole purpose of creating dramatic television content while providing inadequate safety measures to address the predictable medical emergencies. The targeting of pregnant women for this dangerous format reveals the systematic nature of the exploitation involved. Pregnancy creates physical and emotional vulnerability that the show's producers exploited to convince women to participate in scenarios that endangered both their lives and their unborn children's lives. The show specifically sought out women who could be convinced to prioritize television participation over medical safety. The medical risks associated with wilderness childbirth are severe and well documented, including hemorrhaging, infection, prolonged labor, fetal distress, and numerous other complications that require immediate medical intervention to prevent death or permanent disability. The show's format deliberately exposed participants to these risks while providing inadequate medical support to address emergencies. The show's medical oversight was grossly insufficient for the level of risk being introduced. While some medical personnel were present during filming, they were not equipped with the facilities, equipment, or support systems necessary to handle serious obstetric emergencies. The remote locations chosen for filming often made it impossible to quickly transport participants to proper medical facilities if complications arose. The psychological pressure applied to convince women to participate in dangerous wilderness births reveals the manipulative nature of the show's recruitment process. Producers exploited cultural ideas about natural childbirth and maternal strength to convince women that giving birth in dangerous circumstances was empowering rather than reckless endangerment of themselves and their children. The show's editing and presentation deliberately minimized the serious medical risks involved while emphasizing the supposedly natural and empowering aspects of wilderness childbirth. The program failed to adequately inform viewers about the significant medical dangers associated with giving birth without proper medical support, potentially encouraging copycat behavior that could result in preventable deaths. The cases where medical complications did arise during filming reveal the inadequacy of the show's safety measures and medical preparations. When participants experienced bleeding, prolonged labor, or other complications, the available medical support was often insufficient to properly address these emergencies. The show's format essentially guaranteed that serious medical complications would occur while providing inadequate resources to handle them safely. The impact on the infants born during these wilderness births represents an additional dimension of the ethical concerns involved. Newborn infants require immediate medical assessment and intervention if complications arise, but the show's remote locations and limited medical resources made it difficult to provide appropriate neonatal care. The show essentially used infants as props in dangerous scenarios while providing inadequate protection for their health and safety. The show's legal framework exploited gaps in child protection and medical safety regulations that were not designed to address the systematic endangerment of pregnant women and infants for entertainment purposes. Participants signed waivers that attempted to absolve the production company of responsibility for medical complications while the format guaranteed that such complications would occur. The international broadcast of the show has spread its dangerous messages about childbirth and medical care globally, often to audiences in countries with limited access to medical care where copycat behavior could be particularly deadly. The show's portrayal of wilderness childbirth as safe and empowering could influence vulnerable women to make dangerous decisions about their own medical care. These shows represent the application of knowledge about human physiology and psychology specifically designed to cause maximum harm while maintaining plausible deniability about the consequences. The producers involved understood the medical and psychological effects of sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, and medical endangerment, and deliberately applied this knowledge to create compelling television while inflicting predictable harm on participants. The use of medical and scientific language to legitimize harmful practices reveals the sophisticated nature of the exploitation involved. All three shows use terminology from medicine, psychology, and social science to present their harmful formats as legitimate research or beneficial experiences rather than systematic abuse and endangerment. The targeting of specific vulnerabilities demonstrates the predatory nature of these programs. Each show specifically sought out people whose circumstances made them more susceptible to the particular form of harm the show was designed to inflict. Financial desperation for sleep deprivation torture, psychological susceptibility for manipulation experiments, and pregnancy-related vulnerability for medical endangerment. The creation of artificial authority structures and scientific legitimacy made participants more likely to comply with harmful requests and ignore warning signs about their safety.
The involvement of medical professionals, psychological experts, and scientific equipment created false impressions of safety and legitimacy that masked the dangerous nature of the activities involved. The inadequate safety measures and medical support were not accidental oversights but deliberate choices to maximize dramatic content while minimizing costs and complexity. All three shows could have implemented significantly better safety measures but chose not to, because doing so would have reduced the dramatic tension and entertainment value of the harmful situations they were creating. The broader impact on medical ethics and human rights. The systematic harm documented in these shows has broader implications for medical ethics, human rights, and the treatment of vulnerable people in media contexts. These programs normalized the idea that systematic torture, psychological manipulation, and medical endangerment could be justified as entertainment while audiences consumed documentation of human suffering and life-threatening situations. The show's influence on public understanding of medical care, psychological manipulation, and personal safety has been significant and harmful. By presenting torture, manipulation, and medical endangerment as acceptable forms of entertainment, these shows have contributed to the normalization of practices that are recognized as harmful and unethical in every other professional context. The international syndication of these programs has spread their harmful approaches globally, often to countries with weaker regulatory frameworks and fewer protections for vulnerable people. This global influence has contributed to the worldwide spread of exploitive approaches to reality television that systematically endanger participants' lives and well-being. The involvement of medical and psychological professionals in these harmful programs raises serious questions about professional ethics and the responsibilities of qualified practitioners when participating in media productions. The participation of credentialed professionals provides false legitimacy to harmful practices while potentially violating the ethical standards of their respective professions. The participants in these shows continue to suffer from the physical and psychological damage inflicted during their participation, with many experiencing lasting health problems that stem directly from their television experiences. The nature of the harm inflicted, torture, psychological manipulation, and medical endangerment, creates consequences that can persist for years or decades after the original experiences. The show's influence on subsequent reality television programming has been significant, with later programs adopting increasingly extreme approaches to participant endangerment and psychological manipulation. The success of these shows demonstrated to networks that audiences would consume content that systematically harmed participants, while the industry developed increasingly sophisticated methods for inflicting harm while avoiding legal liability. The lack of accountability for the harm caused by these shows reveals the complete inadequacy of current regulatory frameworks and industry self-regulation. The networks and producers involved have never been held responsible for the systematic torture, psychological manipulation, and medical endangerment they orchestrated, while continuing to profit from content that documented serious harm to human beings. The ongoing availability of these programs through streaming platforms and international syndication means that new audiences continue to be exposed to their harmful approaches, while the original participants continue to experience ongoing consequences from their participation. The permanent nature of television content ensures that the documentation of systematic harm continues to be consumed as entertainment indefinitely. Moving forward, the need for recognition and criminal investigation, the cases of Shattered, The Push, and Born in the Wild represent clear examples of how reality television evolved into a system for conducting systematic torture, psychological warfare, and life-threatening endangerment of human beings while claiming to provide entertainment. These shows deliberately designed scenarios to inflict maximum harm while broadcasting the resulting suffering and endangerment as television content. The systematic nature of the harm inflicted in these programs requires recognition that they represent more than just exploitative television. They constitute deliberate attempts to commit torture, psychological abuse, and reckless endangerment that would be considered criminal if conducted outside the protected sphere of television production. The ongoing impact of these shows on both participants and society demonstrates the need for criminal investigation and prosecution of the individuals responsible for orchestrating systematic harm disguised as entertainment. Current regulatory frameworks are completely inadequate to address the level of harm documented in these programs, which crosses the line from unethical entertainment into criminal activity. The development of meaningful accountability measures must include recognition that torture, psychological manipulation designed to push people toward violence, and deliberate medical endangerment constitute serious crimes that cannot be justified by entertainment value, commercial success, or claims of social experimentation. The responsibility for addressing these crimes extends beyond the television industry to include law enforcement agencies, medical licensing boards, psychological professional organizations, and international human rights organizations that have the authority to investigate and prosecute systematic abuse, regardless of the context in which it occurs. These shows represent the complete breakdown of ethical guardrails in reality television and the emergence of programming that constitutes organized criminal activity disguised as entertainment. The sophisticated techniques used to inflict harm demonstrate that the consequences were not accidental, but deliberately engineered by professionals who understood exactly what they were doing to vulnerable human beings. The legacy of these programs continues to influence reality television production and cultural attitudes about the acceptable treatment of vulnerable people in media contexts. Understanding their impact is crucial for developing effective responses to the ongoing criminal activity masquerading as reality television and preventing similar harm in future programming. The systematic harm documented in these shows reveals the urgent need for criminal investigation, prosecution of responsible parties, and fundamental recognition that some forms of television content cross legal boundaries that cannot be justified by any claim of entertainment value or social benefit. The protection of vulnerable people from systematic abuse must take precedence over commercial interests and audience demand for extreme content. The ethical abyss represented by these programs demonstrates that reality television has evolved into something that bears no resemblance to legitimate entertainment, and instead represents organized criminal activity that systematically harms vulnerable people, while generating profit through the documentation and broadcast of their suffering and endangerment.
We try. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The Pickup Artist premiered on VH1 in 2007 and represented a new low in reality television by systematically teaching men psychological manipulation tactics designed to overcome women's resistance to unwanted sexual advances. The show wasn't just exploitative entertainment, it was an instructional program that trained men in techniques that constitute sexual coercion, emotional abuse, and psychological manipulation while presenting these tactics as legitimate dating strategies. The show's format involved bringing together men who claimed to have difficulty dating women and teaching them what were euphemistically called pickup techniques under the guidance of Eric von Markovic, known as Mystery, and other self-proclaimed pickup artists. What these techniques actually constituted was a systematic approach to breaking down women's psychological defenses, manipulating their emotions, and coercing them into sexual situations they would not otherwise choose to enter. The show's central teaching methodology involved training men in psychological manipulation techniques that have been recognized by psychologists and law enforcement as precursors to sexual assault and domestic violence. These techniques included negging, deliberately insulting women to damage their self-esteem and make them seek validation, isolation tactics designed to separate women from their support systems, and what the show called last-minute resistance breaking, techniques specifically designed to overcome women's objections to sexual activity. The normalization of these manipulation tactics through television broadcast legitimized approaches to sexual interaction that constitute criminal behavior in many jurisdictions. The show essentially provided a mass media platform for training men in techniques that are used by sexual predators while presenting this training as harmless dating advice for socially awkward men. The show's participants were explicitly taught to view women as targets to be conquered rather than human beings deserving of respect and genuine consent. The entire philosophical framework underlying the pickup artist methodology treats women as objects whose resistance is to be overcome through manipulation rather than respected as autonomous individuals capable of making their own decisions about sexual activity. The techniques taught on the show included systematic approaches to identifying and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities in women, including targeting women with low self-esteem, those who appeared intoxicated, and those who seemed isolated or vulnerable. These targeting strategies mirror those used by sexual predators and represent clear predatory behavior disguised as dating advice. The show's approach to consent was particularly disturbing, teaching men that women's verbal and nonverbal expressions of disinterest or refusal were obstacles to be overcome, rather than clear communication to be respected. The concept of last-minute resistance breaking explicitly taught men to continue pursuing sexual activity even when women expressed unwillingness or discomfort. The psychological manipulation techniques taught on the show extended beyond individual interactions to include systematic approaches to emotional abuse designed to maintain control over women through cycles of validation and rejection. These techniques create patterns of emotional dependency that are characteristic of abusive relationships and are used by domestic violence perpetrators to maintain control over their victims. The show's impact on participants was immediately concerning, with many men adopting increasingly predatory attitudes toward women and reporting that they viewed the techniques as permission to ignore women's boundaries and consent. Former participants have described developing attitudes toward women that are consistent with those held by sexual offenders and domestic violence perpetrators. The international syndication and online availability of the show have spread these predatory techniques globally, often to audiences in countries with different cultural contexts around gender relations and sexual consent. The show's influence has contributed to the worldwide spread of manipulation tactics that contribute to sexual violence and domestic abuse. The connection between pickup artist culture and actual sexual violence has been extensively documented by law enforcement and researchers studying sexual assault patterns. Many sexual predators use techniques that are identical to those taught on the show, and the normalization of these tactics through mainstream media has made them more widely known and accepted among potential perpetrators. The show's legacy continues through online communities and social media platforms where pickup artist techniques are shared and refined. These communities have been linked to numerous cases of sexual assault, domestic violence, and other crimes against women, with perpetrators explicitly citing pickup artist methodology as justification for their criminal behavior. The legal implications of broadcasting instructional content about sexual coercion and manipulation techniques raise serious questions about media responsibility and criminal complicity. The show essentially provided mass distribution for training materials that enable sexual predators while claiming protection under entertainment and educational content provisions. Celebrity MasterChef UK, unknowingly platforming a serial killer. Celebrity MasterChef UK represents a different but equally disturbing category of crime-linked reality television. Shows that unknowingly provided platforms for individuals who were actively engaged in criminal activity or would later commit serious violent crimes. The case of Stephen Port reveals how reality television's inadequate background screening and focus on entertainment value over public safety can result in giving mass media platforms to dangerous criminals. Stephen Port appeared as a background contestant on Celebrity MasterChef UK before his identity as a serial killer was discovered by law enforcement. Port would later be convicted of murdering 4 young men through fatal drug overdoses administered during sexual encounters, along with numerous other charges related to sexual assault and attempted murder. His appearance on the show occurred while he was actively engaged in predatory behavior that would escalate to serial murder. The show's casting and background screening processes were clearly inadequate to identify Port's dangerous behavior patterns and criminal activities. While he was not a celebrity in the traditional sense, his inclusion in the program demonstrates the superficial nature of the vetting process used by reality television productions when selecting participants for their programs. Port's methodology as a serial killer involved using dating apps and social media to target vulnerable young men, whom he would then drug and sexually assault before administering fatal overdoses. This predatory pattern was already established when he appeared on Celebrity MasterChef, meaning the show provided a platform for someone who was actively engaged in serial sexual assault and would soon escalate to murder. The psychological profile of Stephen Port reveals characteristics that should have been identifiable through proper background screening and psychological evaluation. Port displayed manipulative behavior, lack of empathy, and predatory attitudes that are consistent with serial offenders. The show's failure to identify these red flags demonstrates the inadequacy of reality television's participant screening processes. The show's editing and presentation inadvertently provided insight into Port's manipulative personality and concerning behavior patterns. Viewers who later learned of his crimes could identify disturbing elements in his television appearances that suggested psychological instability and potential dangerousness, raising questions about whether production staff recognized these warning signs. The impact of discovering that Celebrity MasterChef had featured an active serial killer was profound for both the show's production team and audiences who had watched Port's appearances. The revelation that they had unknowingly consumed entertainment content featuring someone who was simultaneously engaged in serial murder created a disturbing connection between reality television and actual criminal activity. The case raises serious questions about the responsibility of reality television productions to conduct thorough background investigations of participants and to have procedures in place for identifying potentially dangerous individuals. The current industry standard of superficial background checks is clearly inadequate when dealing with individuals who may pose risks to public safety. The international broadcast and availability of Celebrity MasterChef episodes featuring Stephen Port means that his television appearances continue to be available for viewing even after his conviction for serial murder. This creates a disturbing situation where audiences can watch a convicted serial killer participating in entertainment programming while knowing about his criminal activities. The legal and ethical implications of having featured a serial killer on mainstream television programming raise questions about industry responsibility and liability when inadequate screening processes result in providing platforms for dangerous criminals. The show's inadvertent complicity in normalizing Port's public presence may have contributed to his ability to continue his predatory activities. Megan Wants a Millionaire, from reality TV to murder. Megan Wants a Millionaire represents the most direct connection between reality television participation and subsequent violent crime, with contestant Ryan Jenkins progressing from reality TV participant to wife murderer within months of the show's filming. The case reveals how reality television's focus on dramatic personalities and controversial behavior can result in selecting participants who pose genuine dangers to others. Ryan Jenkins appeared on Megan Wants a Millionaire as a contestant competing for the affections of Megan Hauserman, a former model and reality TV personality. Jenkins presented himself as a successful entrepreneur and eligible bachelor, but his behavior during filming revealed concerning patterns of manipulation, aggression, and controlling behavior that should have raised red flags about his potential for violence. The show's casting process failed to identify Jenkins's history of domestic violence and concerning behavior toward women, despite these patterns being established before his television appearances. Background screening that should have revealed his unsuitability for a dating-based reality show was either inadequate or ignored by producers focused on creating dramatic television content. Jenkins' behavior during filming included displays of jealousy, possessiveness, and controlling behavior toward both the show's female lead and other contestants. His reactions to competition and rejection revealed anger management issues and potential for violence that were documented by cameras but not recognized as serious warning signs by production staff. The show's format explicitly encouraged competitive and aggressive behavior among male contestants, creating an environment that rewarded the kind of controlling and manipulative behavior that Jenkins displayed. The program's emphasis on wealth, status, and romantic competition created dynamics that may have reinforced Jenkins' existing predatory tendencies. After filming concluded, Jenkins married Jasmine Fiore, a model and reality TV personality, in a relationship that quickly became characterized by domestic violence and controlling behavior. Friends and family members later reported that Jenkins displayed the same manipulative and controlling behavior in his marriage that he had exhibited during his reality television appearances. The escalation from reality TV participation to domestic violence and murder occurred within months of the show's filming, suggesting that Jenkins' participation in the competitive and manipulative environment of reality television may have reinforced or escalated his existing violent tendencies. The connection between his television behavior and subsequent criminal activity demonstrates the potential for reality TV to serve as a training ground or catalyst for violent behavior. Jenkins murdered his wife Jasmine Fiore in August 2009, mutilating her body in an attempt to prevent identification before fleeing to Canada, where he died by suicide while being pursued by law enforcement. The brutality of the murder and Jenkins' attempts to conceal his crime revealed the depth of his violent and predatory nature. The discovery of Jenkins' crime resulted in the immediate cancellation of Megan Wants a Millionaire, with VH1 pulling the show from broadcast before all episodes had aired. The decision to cancel the show demonstrated the network's recognition that continuing to broadcast content featuring a murderer would be inappropriate and potentially harmful. The case raised serious questions about reality television's role in normalizing and potentially catalyzing violent behavior among participants. Jenkins' progression from reality TV contestant to murderer within months of filming suggests that participation in reality television may have contributed to his escalating violent behavior. The legal implications of the case included investigations into whether the show's production company had adequately screened Jenkins and whether they bore any responsibility for the consequences of featuring someone who would go on to commit murder. The case highlighted the inadequacy of current industry standards for participant screening and safety protocols, the systematic connection between reality TV and criminal behavior. These cases reveal a systematic connection between reality television participation and criminal behavior that extends far beyond coincidental association. The shows examined here demonstrate how reality television can serve as a training ground for predatory behavior, a platform for active criminals, and a catalyst for escalating violence among participants predisposed to criminal activity. The casting processes used by reality television productions systematically select for personality traits and behavioral patterns that are associated with criminal behavior, including narcissism, manipulation, aggression, and lack of empathy. These traits make for compelling television but also indicate increased risk for criminal activity. The competitive and manipulative environments created by reality television shows can serve as training grounds for criminal behavior by rewarding manipulation, aggression, and exploitation of others. Participants learn that these behaviors are not only acceptable but celebrated and financially rewarded within the reality television context. The normalization of predatory and manipulative behavior through reality television broadcasts contributes to broader cultural acceptance of tactics that are used by criminals to target and exploit victims. Shows like The Pickup Artist explicitly teach criminal techniques while others implicitly normalize behavior patterns that are characteristic of violent offenders. The inadequate screening and monitoring procedures used by reality television productions fail to identify participants who pose risks to public safety while providing these individuals with platforms that can enhance their ability to target and exploit victims. The combination of poor screening and mass media exposure creates dangerous opportunities for predatory individuals. The broader impact on crime and public safety. The connection between reality television and criminal behavior has broader implications for public safety and crime prevention that extend far beyond individual cases. The systematic promotion of manipulative and predatory behavior through mainstream media contributes to cultural normalization of tactics that facilitate criminal activity. The international distribution of reality television content spreads harmful behavioral models globally, often to audiences in countries with different cultural contexts and legal frameworks around consent, domestic violence, and sexual assault. This global influence contributes to worldwide increases in criminal behavior patterns that mirror those promoted through reality television. The lack of accountability for reality television's role in promoting and facilitating criminal behavior reveals gaps in current regulatory frameworks and law enforcement approaches to media-facilitated crime. The protection of free speech and entertainment content has been used to shield clearly harmful programming from appropriate legal scrutiny. The ongoing availability of crime-linked reality television content through streaming platforms and reruns means that programming featuring criminals or promoting criminal techniques continues to be consumed by new audiences, perpetuating the harmful influence of these shows long after their original broadcast. Moving forward, recognition and legal accountability. The cases examined here represent clear evidence that reality television has become complicit in actual criminal activity through its systematic promotion of predatory behavior, inadequate screening of dangerous participants, and normalization of tactics that facilitate violence against vulnerable people. The connection between reality television and criminal behavior requires recognition that some forms of entertainment content cross legal boundaries and contribute to actual harm in ways that cannot be justified by claims of free speech or entertainment value. The systematic teaching of criminal techniques and promotion of predatory behavior constitutes a form of criminal facilitation that should be subject to legal accountability. The development of meaningful regulatory frameworks must include recognition that reality television's influence on criminal behavior creates public safety risks that require oversight and intervention. Current industry self-regulation has proven completely inadequate to prevent the promotion of criminal activity and the platforming of dangerous individuals. The responsibility for addressing these issues extends beyond the television industry to include law enforcement agencies, legal systems, and policymakers who have the authority to investigate and prosecute media complicity in criminal activity. The protection of public safety must take precedence over commercial interests and entertainment industry profits. The systematic nature of reality television's connection to criminal behavior requires coordinated responses that address both the immediate dangers posed by specific programs and the broader cultural impact of normalizing predatory and violent behavior through mainstream media. These cases demonstrate that reality television has evolved beyond entertainment into something that actively contributes to criminal activity and public safety risks. The industry's continued resistance to meaningful reform and accountability measures suggests that external intervention is necessary to protect public safety from the harmful influence of crime-linked reality television programming. The legacy of these programs continues to influence both reality television production and criminal behavior patterns, creating an ongoing cycle where harmful content inspires criminal activity while criminal activity generates new harmful content. Breaking this cycle requires recognition that some forms of entertainment are too dangerous to be protected under current legal and regulatory frameworks. Understanding the connection between reality television and criminal behavior is crucial for developing effective responses to media-facilitated crime and preventing future cases where entertainment programming contributes to real-world violence and exploitation. The protection of vulnerable people from predatory behavior must be prioritized over industry profits and audience demand for extreme content. The Great Donor Show aired on Dutch television in 2007 as what appeared to be the most morally reprehensible reality show ever conceived, a program where 3 kidney patients competed for the privilege of receiving a kidney from a terminally ill donor who would choose the recipient based on their televised appeals. The show generated international outrage and condemnation before being revealed as an elaborate hoax designed to raise awareness about organ donation shortages. However, the psychological trauma inflicted on participants, viewers, and the broader public was entirely real, demonstrating how reality television can cause genuine harm even when the central premise is fabricated. The show's format was designed to be as emotionally manipulative and ethically disturbing as possible, with 3 kidney patients making televised appeals to a woman identified as Lisa, who was supposedly dying of brain cancer and had volunteered to donate her kidney before her death. The patients were required to reveal intimate details about their medical conditions, family situations, and personal struggles while competing for what they believed was their only chance at survival. The casting process involved identifying real kidney patients who were genuinely in need of transplants and desperate enough to participate in what they believed was a legitimate opportunity to receive life-saving treatment. These individuals were already dealing with severe medical conditions, psychological stress, and uncertainty about their survival, making them extremely vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation. The psychological manipulation employed by the show was profound and systematic, requiring genuinely ill patients to perform their suffering for television audiences while competing against other desperate people in similar situations. The participants were forced to present their cases in ways that maximized emotional impact while minimizing the dignity and privacy that medical patients typically expect and deserve. The show's editing and presentation deliberately emphasized the most heartbreaking aspects of each patient's situation while creating artificial drama around the selection process. Viewers were manipulated into emotional investment in the patient's stories while being led to believe they were witnessing a genuine life-or-death competition for medical resources. The involvement of medical professionals and the use of medical terminology and procedures created false legitimacy that made the hoax more believable while simultaneously trivializing genuine medical emergencies and the real suffering of people waiting for organ transplants. The show exploited public trust in medical institutions while undermining the serious nature of organ donation and medical ethics. The international media coverage and public outrage generated by the show created a global conversation about reality television ethics, but this attention came at the expense of genuine trauma inflicted on participants who believed they were competing for their lives. The patients involved experienced real psychological distress while participating in what they thought was a legitimate medical opportunity. The revelation that the show was a hoax came only after the broadcast concluded, meaning that participants, viewers, and the broader public experienced the full emotional impact of believing they had witnessed a genuine medical competition. The psychological damage caused by the deception was not erased by the revelation of its true purpose, but instead created additional trauma through feelings of betrayal and manipulation. The show's creators justified the hoax as necessary to raise awareness about organ donation shortages, but this purported educational purpose did not mitigate the psychological harm caused to participants and viewers who were deceived into believing they were witnessing real medical desperation and potentially preventable deaths. The long-term impact on the patients who participated has been severe and lasting, with many reporting ongoing psychological trauma from the experience of being manipulated into performing their medical desperation for television audiences. The betrayal of trust involved in the hoax created additional psychological damage beyond the original exploitation. The show's effect on public trust in both reality television and medical institutions has been significant, contributing to increased skepticism about media representation of medical issues while potentially undermining confidence in legitimate organ donation programs. The hoax created confusion about the boundaries between entertainment and medical reality that may have discouraged some people from participating in genuine organ donation programs. The legal and ethical implications of the hoax raised questions about informed consent, medical ethics, and the responsibility of media organizations when conducting elaborate deceptions involving vulnerable populations. The participants could not provide truly informed consent because they were deliberately deceived about the nature of their participation. The international attention generated by the show demonstrated how reality television had reached a point where audiences were willing to believe that networks would broadcast genuine life-or-death medical competitions, revealing the extent to which exploitative content had been normalized in popular culture. Extreme Makeover, the rejection episode that destroyed a family. Extreme Makeover represented reality television's attempt to create feel-good transformation content, but the show's selection and rejection processes created psychological devastation that in some cases proved fatal. The most tragic example involved a family whose application for the show resulted in their private struggles being broadcast to millions of viewers, followed by cruel rejection that contributed to a cascade of psychological trauma culminating in suicide. The show's application process required families to reveal intimate details about their personal lives, relationships, and perceived inadequacies, while essentially begging for television intervention in their problems. This process was inherently dehumanizing, requiring people to present themselves as sufficiently pathetic and desperate to deserve help, while providing entertainment value for viewers. The case that most clearly demonstrates the show's harmful impact involved a family whose application was rejected after extensive filming and evaluation. The rejection itself was devastating, but the show's decision to broadcast portions of the family's application materials and the cruel comments made by family members during the selection process created additional layers of public humiliation and private trauma. The family's application materials included intimate discussions of personal problems, relationship issues, and individual insecurities that were never intended for public consumption. When the show decided to feature their rejection as content, these private struggles became public entertainment while the family received none of the supposed benefits that might have justified the exposure. The broadcast of the rejection episode included family members making cruel and disparaging comments about each other that were captured during the filming process but had never been intended for public viewing. These comments, broadcast to millions of viewers, created lasting damage to family relationships while exposing the participants to public ridicule and humiliation. The psychological impact of the rejection and subsequent broadcast was particularly severe for one family member who had been especially vulnerable during the filming process. The combination of public rejection, family humiliation, and broadcast of private struggles created a perfect storm of psychological trauma that proved impossible to overcome. The editing and presentation of the rejection episode deliberately emphasized the most emotionally damaging aspects of the family's situation while providing no support or follow-up care for the psychological harm being inflicted. The show treated the family's pain and disappointment as entertainment content while abandoning them to deal with the consequences of their participation. The long-term consequences of the family's participation in Extreme Makeover were devastating and far-reaching. The public humiliation, family conflict, and psychological trauma created by the show's rejection process contributed to ongoing mental health struggles that affected multiple family members for years after the broadcast. The most tragic outcome occurred when one family member died by suicide years after the show's broadcast, with family members directly linking the death to the psychological trauma caused by their participation in Extreme Makeover. The suicide represented the ultimate consequence of reality television's willingness to exploit vulnerable people for entertainment purposes. The show's responsibility for the long-term consequences of their selection and rejection processes was never adequately addressed by the network or production company. The family received no ongoing support or assistance in dealing with the psychological trauma caused by their participation, despite the show's role in creating and amplifying their problems. The case demonstrates how reality television's impact on participants can extend far beyond the original broadcast, creating cascading psychological trauma that affects entire families for years or decades. The show's intervention in the family's life created more problems than it solved, ultimately contributing to preventable tragedy. The legal and ethical implications of the case raise serious questions about reality television's responsibility for the long-term consequences of their programming decisions. The show's decision to broadcast the family's rejection and private struggles without providing adequate support or follow-up care contributed directly to psychological harm that ultimately proved fatal. Wife Swap, The Stockdales. From extreme isolation to family annihilation, Wife Swap's episode featuring the Stockdale family represents one of the most tragic examples of how reality television can expose and exacerbate family dysfunction to the point where it ultimately leads to murder and suicide. The Stockdale family appeared on the show as an example of extreme homeschooling and religious isolation, but their participation in reality television helped expose underlying problems that would eventually explode into violence that destroyed the family entirely. The Stockdale family was chosen for Wife Swap because of their extreme lifestyle, which included complete isolation from mainstream society, intensive religious homeschooling, and parental control so severe that the children had virtually no contact with the outside world. The family's isolation was so complete that some of the children had never been away from home or interacted with people outside their immediate family. The show's format required the family to temporarily accept a different mother figure with contrasting values and parenting approaches, creating artificial conflict designed to generate dramatic television content. For the already isolated and psychologically fragile Stockdale children, this disruption to their extremely controlled environment created additional psychological stress and confusion. The editing and presentation of the Stockdale family emphasized the most extreme aspects of their isolation and control while presenting their lifestyle as entertainment for viewers who were encouraged to judge and ridicule their unconventional choices. The family's genuine struggles with social isolation and psychological control were treated as amusing quirks rather than serious family dysfunction. The broadcast of the Wife Swap episode exposed the Stockdale family's extreme isolation and control to millions of viewers, creating public attention and scrutiny that the family was completely unprepared to handle. The children, who had been raised in complete isolation, suddenly found themselves the subjects of national television attention and public discussion. The psychological impact of the television exposure on the Stockdale children was severe and lasting, with the sudden exposure to outside perspectives and public attention creating confusion and conflict about their family's lifestyle and values. Children who had been completely isolated from mainstream society were suddenly confronted with evidence that their family's extreme control was viewed as problematic by others. The show's intervention in the family's dynamics created additional stress and conflict within an already dysfunctional family system. The temporary disruption of the extreme control that had defined the family's existence created cracks in the psychological structure that had held the family together, leading to increasing instability and conflict. Jacob Stockdale, one of the sons featured on the show, struggled particularly with the aftermath of the family's television appearance and the conflicting messages he received about his family's lifestyle. The psychological impact of the show's intervention, combined with the family's existing dysfunction, contributed to his increasing psychological instability and violent ideation. Years after the Wife Swap episode aired, the psychological trauma and family dysfunction that had been exposed and exacerbated by the show culminated in tragedy when Jacob Stockdale murdered his mother and younger brother before attempting suicide. The murders represented the ultimate consequence of the psychological damage and family dysfunction that had been amplified by reality television intervention. The connection between the family's participation in Wife Swap and the eventual murders is complex but undeniable, with the show's intervention contributing to the psychological instability and family conflict that ultimately led to violence.
The exposure of the family's extreme dysfunction without adequate support or intervention created conditions that made tragedy more likely. The investigation into the murders revealed the extent of the psychological damage that had been building within the family since their television appearance. Jacob Stockdale's psychological state at the time of the murders showed clear signs of the long-term trauma and confusion that had been developing since the family's exposure to outside perspectives through the show. The tragedy of the Stockdale family demonstrates how reality television's intervention in dysfunctional family systems can have catastrophic long-term consequences when no adequate support or follow-up care is provided. The show's decision to expose the family's extreme isolation and dysfunction without providing resources to address these problems contributed to conditions that made violence more likely. The legal and ethical implications of the case raise serious questions about reality television's responsibility when their programming exposes serious family dysfunction or psychological problems. The show's intervention in the Stockdale family's life created more problems than it solved, ultimately contributing to preventable tragedy. The science of cascading trauma. These cases demonstrate how reality television can create cascading psychological trauma that spreads far beyond the original participants to affect families, communities, and even entire societies. The trauma inflicted by reality television doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling but continues to generate new victims and new suffering for years or decades after the original broadcast. The psychological mechanisms involved in reality television trauma are complex and multifaceted, involving elements of public humiliation, betrayal of trust, exploitation of vulnerability, and abandonment by supposed helpers. These factors combine to create psychological damage that is often more severe and lasting than the original problems that led people to seek reality television intervention. The targeting of vulnerable populations by reality television creates conditions where psychological trauma is almost inevitable, with shows specifically seeking out people who are already dealing with medical crises, family dysfunction, financial desperation, or other factors that impair their ability to protect themselves from exploitation. The artificial environments and manipulated scenarios created by reality television often exacerbate existing psychological problems while creating new sources of trauma and conflict. The show's emphasis on drama and conflict means that participants' problems are deliberately amplified rather than addressed or resolved. The lack of adequate psychological support and follow-up care means that participants are left to deal with the consequences of their reality television experiences without the resources or assistance needed to process and recover from the trauma inflicted during production. The broader impact on families and society. The traumatic outcomes documented in these cases have broader implications for family stability, mental health services, and social trust that extend far beyond the immediate participants. The normalization of family destruction and psychological trauma as entertainment content contributes to broader cultural acceptance of exploitation and abuse. The international distribution of these traumatic outcomes through television broadcasts and streaming platforms spreads the psychological damage globally, often to audiences who consume the trauma without understanding its real-world consequences or the ongoing suffering of the people involved. The failure of mental health and social service systems to recognize and address reality television trauma has left many victims without adequate support or resources for recovery. The unique nature of reality television trauma often makes it difficult for traditional therapeutic approaches to address the complex combination of public humiliation, betrayal, and ongoing exposure that characterizes these experiences. The legal system's inadequate response to reality television trauma has left victims without meaningful recourse for the harm they have experienced, while allowing networks and production companies to continue profiting from content that has caused documented psychological damage and contributed to preventable deaths.
Moving forward, recognition and prevention.
The cases examined here represent clear evidence that reality television has evolved into a system that systematically creates psychological trauma so severe that it can lead to suicide and murder. The documented connections between reality television participation and these tragic outcomes require immediate recognition and intervention to prevent future casualties. The development of meaningful protective measures must include recognition that reality television trauma represents a distinct category of psychological harm that requires specialized understanding and treatment approaches. Current mental health and social service systems are not equipped to address the unique combination of factors that create reality television trauma. The establishment of accountability mechanisms for reality television's role in creating traumatic outcomes must include legal frameworks that hold networks and production companies responsible for the long-term consequences of their programming decisions. The current system of waivers and legal protections has proven inadequate to prevent serious harm while allowing continued profit from traumatic content. The need for immediate intervention in cases where reality television exposes serious family dysfunction, medical crises, or psychological instability requires the development of mandatory support and follow-up protocols that continue long after filming concludes. The current practice of abandoning participants after production ends has directly contributed to preventable tragedies. The recognition that some families and individuals are too vulnerable or dysfunctional to safely participate in reality television requires the development of screening protocols that prioritize participant welfare over entertainment value. The current practice of specifically targeting the most vulnerable and dysfunctional participants has created conditions that make tragic outcomes more likely. These cases demonstrate that reality television has become a public health crisis that is directly contributing to suicide, murder, and family destruction while being protected by inadequate regulatory frameworks and industry self-regulation. The protection of vulnerable people from exploitation must take precedence over commercial interests and entertainment industry profits. The legacy of these tragic outcomes continues to influence both reality television production and the lives of countless families who have been affected by the industry's systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. Understanding the full scope of reality television trauma is crucial for developing effective responses and preventing future tragedies. The systematic nature of reality television's contribution to psychological trauma and violent outcomes requires coordinated responses from mental health professionals, legal authorities, regulatory bodies, and advocacy organizations working together to protect vulnerable people from an industry that has proven itself willing to sacrifice human welfare for entertainment value and commercial success. The documented connections between reality television participation and suicide, murder, and family destruction represent a clear indictment of an industry that has prioritized entertainment value over human welfare while creating a system of exploitation that continues to claim new victims with each new season of programming. The time for meaningful intervention and accountability is long overdue.